My name is Vanessa, and I am 33 years old. After 5 years of absolute silence, my parents invited me to dinner to finally fix things. They said they wanted a quiet talk, just the three of us, to heal the wounds of the past. I showed up with an open heart, expecting apologies and a fresh start. Instead, I walked into a private dining room and found 13 extended family members already seated. Lobster shells littered the table. Wagyu steaks were half-eaten. 3 bottles of wine that cost $1,600 each sat completely empty. Then my father smirked at me and said, "You have got the bill right." I did not scream or cry. I simply motioned for the waiter, whispered 2 sentences into his ear, and watched his eyes widen in shock. 15 minutes later, my family learned a very hard lesson. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your peace from a toxic family. Growing up in our affluent suburban neighborhood, I learned very early that love was highly conditional. My parents, Richard and Patricia, valued status above everything else. My older brother, Cameron, was their golden child. He was 35 years old and could do no wrong in their eyes. He was the son who went to the right schools and said the right things. I was the scapegoat, the daughter who never quite fit their mold of perfection. 5 years ago, I walked away from their constant criticism and relentless manipulation. I changed my phone number and poured every ounce of my soul into building my own life. I built a luxury hospitality group from the ground up. It was brutal and exhausting work, but it was mine. I never told them about my success. I preferred the quiet safety of my absolute independence. So when my mother sent a letter to my old apartment address begging for a chance to reconnect, I hesitated. The letter was forwarded to my new residence. She wrote about how much she missed her daughter. She said my father was getting older and they realized life was too short for grudges. They suggested we meet at the Monarch for a quiet cup of coffee and a light dinner. The Monarch was the most exclusive and expensive seafood and steakhouse in the entire city. It was incredibly difficult to get a reservation there. I agreed to go because some foolish, childish part of my heart still wanted a mother and a father who loved me. I wanted to believe people could change. I wanted to believe that 5 years of distance had given them a new perspective on family. I drove to the restaurant feeling a mixture of anxiety and fragile hope. I wore a simple black dress. It was a custom designer piece, but it had no visible logos. I preferred quiet luxury. I did not need to flash brands to prove my worth anymore. The valet took my car, and I walked through the heavy brass doors of the Monarch. The interior was stunning with dark wood paneling and warm ambient lighting reflecting off crystal chandeliers. The hostess smiled warmly and asked for my name. When I told her I was looking for Richard and Patricia, she nodded and led me toward the back of the restaurant. We bypassed the main dining area entirely. She guided me toward the private VIP dining rooms reserved for large, exclusive parties. My stomach gave a slight lurch. A private VIP room seemed excessive for a quiet reconciliation coffee between 3 people. The hostess pushed open the heavy oak double doors and the noise hit me instantly. Laughter and loud voices filled the room. I stood frozen in the doorway. My fragile hope shattered into a million sharp pieces. There were 13 people seated around a massive mahogany table. My parents were at the head of the table holding court. My brother Cameron was there along with my aunts and uncles and several cousins I had not seen in years. This was not a quiet reconciliation. This was a spectacle. A trap hidden behind false promises. My mother Patricia spotted me first. Her eyes lit up not with maternal warmth, but with the calculating gleam of a predator. "Vanessa, darling," she called out loudly, ensuring the entire room stopped their conversations to look at me. "You finally made it. We were beginning to think you would not show up." I stepped into the room, my face carefully blank. I looked at my father, Richard, who gave me a dismissive nod before taking another sip of his dark red wine. There was no apology in his eyes. There was no remorse for the 5 years of silence. Cameron leaned back in his leather chair and looked me up and down. He wore an expensive-looking suit that I knew he probably could not afford. He always projected the image of a wealthy venture capitalist, but I knew he was struggling. "Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence," Cameron sneered. "That is a very plain dress, Vanessa. Are things still tight financially? I heard you were still running that little catering gig of yours. Is that paying the rent these days?" Several cousins chuckled. The heat of humiliation threatened to rise in my cheeks, but I forced it down. I had spent years dealing with elite board members and ruthless investors. My brother and his petty insults felt remarkably small in comparison. "I am doing just fine, Cameron," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "It is interesting to see so many people here. I was told this would be a private meeting for just the three of us." My father waved his hand as if swatting away a fly. "Family is family, Vanessa. We decided to make a real celebration out of this. Take a seat and catch up. We have been having a wonderful time." I looked at the empty chair they had left for me at the very end of the table, far away from the center of conversation. It was the physical manifestation of my place in this family. I walked over and sat down, placing my clutch on my lap. Before I could even pour myself a glass of water, my mother, Patricia, started talking to her sister across the table. Her voice was deliberately loud. She wanted everyone to hear her. "It is just such a shame," Patricia sighed heavily. "I was just telling everyone about how much potential Vanessa had. She was enrolled in such a prestigious business program. She could have had a real career. But instead, she threw it all away to go flip burgers. It is honestly embarrassing for the family reputation." My aunt nodded sympathetically, casting a pitying glance in my direction. "I know, Patricia. It must be so hard for you to see Cameron doing so well in venture capital, while Vanessa struggles in food service. But you are a good mother for checking in on her." I sat there listening to them rewrite my life story. I did not drop out to flip burgers. I left a rigid, toxic educational environment to start a culinary business that eventually grew into a massive hospitality empire. But they did not know that. They did not want to know that. They only wanted a narrative where Cameron was the ultimate success and I was the pitiful failure they could look down upon. It made them feel superior. It fed their bottomless egos. Cameron laughed loudly, drawing attention back to himself. "Do not be too hard on her, Mom. Someone has to cook the food for the people who actually run the world right. Hey, Vanessa, if you ever need a job washing dishes, let me know. My firm is hosting a big investor dinner next week. We could probably use some extra help in the kitchen." The cruelty was so casual and so deeply ingrained in their dynamic. 5 years of silence had changed absolutely nothing. They were the exact same people who had driven me away. I took a slow, deep breath and let my eyes wander across the massive dining table. That was when the true magnitude of the situation began to dawn on me. I looked closely at the wreckage of their feast. This was not a normal family dinner. This was a display of aggressive gluttony. There were empty plates that had clearly held Wagyu tomahawk steaks. Those steaks cost hundreds of dollars each. There were towering silver structures holding the remnants of jumbo shrimp and cracked lobster claws and empty oyster shells. The seafood towers alone would have cost a fortune. But the most alarming detail sat right in the center of the table. 3 empty wine bottles. I recognized the label immediately because my hospitality group regularly purchased them for our high-end clients. It was a rare vintage Bordeaux. At a restaurant like the Monarch, those bottles were priced around $1,600 each. They had consumed 3 of them. I did mental math quickly. Between 13 people ordering the most expensive steaks, the colossal seafood towers, appetizers, side dishes, and nearly $5,000 in wine, the bill would be astronomical. I looked at my parents. They were smiling smugly. They looked completely unbothered by the cost of the feast they had just consumed. My gaze shifted back to my father. He was watching me with a calculated expression. He was waiting for something. And then I understood. The sudden invitation after 5 years of silence. The choice of the most expensive restaurant in the city. the massive guest list of extended family members who loved to watch me suffer, the deliberate consumption of the most premium items on the menu. They did not bring me here to apologize. They did not bring me here to rebuild our family. They brought me here for a specific twisted purpose. My stomach turned to ice as the realization fully formed in my mind. I was looking at thousands of dollars of consumed luxury, and I knew exactly why they had left that one empty chair waiting for me at the end of the table. Plates had barely been cleared from the massive mahogany table when the quiet waiter returned to our section of the private dining room. He moved with the polished, invisible grace expected at a high-end establishment, carrying a thick black leather booklet holding the financial damage of their incredibly indulgent feast. The room grew slightly quieter as he approached the head of the table, where my father sat like a king holding court. The waiter placed the booklet directly in front of my father, perfectly aligned with his crystal water glass. I watched my father look down at the leather cover. He did not bother to open it. He did not check the itemized list to ensure the rare bottles of wine or the multiple premium steaks were correctly charged. He did not reach for his wallet or pretend to search for a credit card. Instead, he just smirked. My father placed his manicured hand flat on top of the leather cover and pushed it forward with a sudden, aggressive burst of energy. The heavy booklet slid smoothly down the long, polished expanse of the dark mahogany table, making a quiet scraping sound that seemed to echo in the sudden stillness of the room. It stopped precisely in front of my empty plate. I stared down at the black leather. A small printed receipt peeked out from the edge of the binding. The bold black ink at the bottom of the premium paper was impossible to miss. $3,699. I let my eyes trace the numbers again, taking in the sheer audacity of the sum. It was an astronomical amount for a single casual dinner. It was a sum generated entirely by their reckless, uninhibited greed. They had gorged themselves without hesitation. That specific number, $3,699, felt like a physical blow designed to transport me back to my darkest days. It was an amount that would have completely bankrupted the younger 22-year-old version of myself they had driven away so mercilessly. I remembered sleeping on a terrible mattress in a freezing apartment, desperately counting pennies to buy cheap pasta because they had cut off my college funding. I remembered the crippling anxiety of wondering if I would have enough money to keep my electricity turned on during the harsh winter months. They knew exactly how much I had struggled when I first left their toxic household. They assumed I was still that same terrified broke girl scrambling to survive on minimum wage. They intentionally ran up a massive tab believing it would financially ruin me for months or force me into deep debt. I looked up from the staggering bill and met my father's angry, expectant gaze. His face held a self-satisfied, vicious smirk that I remembered vividly from my painful childhood. "Why are you giving this to me?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely neutral and devoid of the panic they were so desperately waiting to witness. My father slammed his hand flat on the table, causing the expensive crystal water glasses to vibrate violently. "You owe us for raising you, Vanessa," he announced, his voice booming loudly through the enclosed private dining room, ensuring every single person heard him clearly. "Consider this your back pay for being such a massive disappointment to this family. You have got the bill right." He leaned back in his luxurious leather chair, crossing his arms across his chest, like a judge who had just delivered a completely inescapable and flawless guilty verdict. The silence that followed his cruel declaration was utterly suffocating. Every relative sitting at the long table immediately stopped talking. All 13 pairs of eyes locked onto me simultaneously. I could feel the collective weight of their harsh judgment and sheer entitlement pressing down on my shoulders. This was their elaborate trap. This was the grand finale of their highly orchestrated evening of gluttony. They wanted to break me in front of a captive audience. They wanted to remind me that no matter how far I ran or how much time passed, I would always be the designated family scapegoat who owed them a fabricated debt I could never possibly repay. My mother, Patricia, adjusted her pearl necklace and looked at me with a deeply theatrical expression of feigned disappointment, silently commanding me to surrender to their demands and accept my designated role as their ultimate financial victim. If you cannot afford it, maybe you can go talk to the kitchen staff. My brother, Cameron, suddenly chimed in, breaking the heavy silence. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting the cuffs of his suit jacket and looking thoroughly amused by my orchestrated predicament. I am sure they desperately need someone to wash dishes in the back if your little credit card inevitably declines. They might even let you take home some of these leftover lobster shells for a nice soup. He let out a loud, obnoxious laugh that grated against my ears. Cameron had always loved playing the role of the wealthy, successful venture capitalist whenever he was around our extended family. He desperately needed everyone in the room to believe he was a massive financial success, while simultaneously ensuring they viewed me as an absolute pathetic failure who was completely beneath his elevated social status. A few of my younger cousins immediately snickered at Cameron's cruel, unprovoked joke, eager to align themselves with the golden child of the family. My aunt whispered something quietly to my mother, who nodded in solemn agreement, while throwing a deeply condescending glance in my direction. They were thoroughly enjoying this public execution. They were feasting on my engineered humiliation just as greedily and shamelessly as they had feasted on the premium seafood towers and the wildly expensive Wagyu steaks. The toxic family dynamic was on full vibrant display, illuminating exactly why I had cut off all contact with these terrible people 5 years ago. They fed off each other negative energy, reinforcing their shared delusion that they were fundamentally superior to me. Every smirk, every snicker, and every mocking glance was designed to completely strip away my dignity and force me into absolute miserable submission before them. In the past, this was the exact precise moment where my entire spirit would have instantly crumbled under their immense coordinated pressure. The old Vanessa would have felt the familiar painful burn of hot tears stinging the corners of her eyes. She would have immediately apologized profusely for being such a massive burden to her perfect family. She would have frantically pulled out her worn debit card, silently praying to God that it would not decline in front of the waiter, while internally panicking about how she would manage to pay her rent the following month. She would have passively accepted the blatant financial abuse as the inevitable, unavoidable cost of simply existing as a member of this incredibly toxic family. She would have internalized their vicious cruelty, believing deep down that she truly deserved to be treated like disposable garbage because she was not good enough. But the old, terrified Vanessa was completely dead and gone. She died the very day I finally realized that their conditional love was a purely transactional arrangement I could never possibly afford to maintain. I did not cry a single tear. I did not raise my voice in defense or throw an angry, dramatic tantrum. I did not reach into my small designer purse to pull out a credit card to satisfy their endless greed. I looked at the 13 people sitting around the table and saw them not as powerful, authoritative figures, but as hollow, pathetic individuals playing a desperate game of dress-up. They were small, bitter people who needed to tear down their own flesh and blood just to feel a fleeting, momentary sense of importance. Their carefully constructed illusions of wealth and superiority meant absolutely nothing to the strong, independent woman I had finally become. The seconds stretched out into a long, heavy, agonizing pause. The entire extended family sat perfectly still, holding their breath and staring at me intensely. They were eagerly expecting me to either burst into hysterical tears, cause a massive, embarrassing scene, or submissively empty my entire savings account to appease their demands. My father's smirk began to falter ever so slightly when I refused to break eye contact. My mother tapped her manicured fingernails nervously against the dark wood of the table, unsettled by my complete lack of panic. I let the silence hang in the air, letting their own anxiety build. Instead of breaking down, I simply sat up straighter and let a slow, warm, genuinely relaxed smile spread across my face. Without breaking my gaze from my father, I smoothly raised my right hand and motioned for the general manager David to approach our table immediately. David stepped forward instantly, His posture was impeccably straight, his expression a mask of professional deference. He had known me for 3 years, ever since my hospitality group acquired the Monarch and transformed it into the city crown jewel. He knew exactly who I was, but he also knew my strict policy regarding personal discretion during dining hours. He leaned down, placing his hands neatly behind his back, awaiting my instruction. My family watched this interaction with undisguised curiosity. My father puffed out his chest, assuming I was about to beg the manager for a payment plan or a humiliating discount. My mother leaned in closer, eager to witness my total financial surrender. Instead, I kept my eyes locked onto my father's confused face while I whispered 2 precise sentences into David's ear. Close out my sparkling water on the owner tab, and when I leave, if they cannot pay this bill in full, call the police. David did not flinch. He did not ask for clarification. He simply offered a crisp, imperceptible nod and stepped back from the table. I placed my cloth napkin neatly beside my empty plate. I picked up my clutch and stood. The sudden movement caught my family entirely off guard. My father opened his mouth to issue another command, but I did not give him the opportunity. I smiled warmly at the 13 faces staring back at me. "Thank you so much for the invitation to catch up," I said, making sure my voice carried clearly across the quiet private room. It was incredibly revealing. "I hope you all have a truly pleasant evening." Before anyone could formulate a response, I turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. I did not rush. I did not look back. My heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor, a steady beat of absolute liberation. I pushed through the glass double doors of the restaurant and stepped out into the crisp evening air. The valet immediately recognized me and jogged to retrieve my car. I stood under the warm glow of the entrance awning and turned back to look through the expansive front windows. The private dining room was slightly elevated and perfectly visible from my vantage point. I watched the scene unfold like a silent movie. David walked back to the head of the table. He picked up the black leather booklet containing the $3,699 bill and placed it squarely back in front of my father. I could not hear the words being spoken, but the body language was unmistakable. David was politely informing Richard that his daughter had departed and the balance remained entirely his responsibility. My father laughed. It was a big, hearty, theatrical laugh, designed to show the rest of the table that he was completely unbothered. He waved his hand dismissively and reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a sleek silver metal platinum card. He dropped it onto the leather booklet with an arrogant flick of his wrist. David picked up the card and stepped over to the discreet payment terminal located near the corner of the private room. My father returned to his conversation, picking up his empty wine glass and gesturing grandly to my uncle across the table. A minute passed. Then David returned to the table. He placed the platinum card back down in front of my father. He leaned in and spoke. I watched my father's confident smile instantly vanish. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. He snatched the card from the table and stared at it as if it had personally betrayed him. The card had declined. My father frantically patted his pockets, searching for another card. He pulled out a standard blue debit card and shoved it toward David. David processed it. Declined again. The atmosphere at the table shifted drastically. The casual, wealthy facade my parents had spent the entire evening projecting was rapidly crumbling. My mother clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes darting nervously around the room to see if any of the other high society diners had noticed their predicament. Cameron jumped out of his seat. He puffed out his chest and pulled out his own wallet, acting the part of the savior venture capitalist. He slapped a gold card onto the table, giving my father a reassuring pat on the shoulder. He looked around the table with a smug expression, assuring everyone that he would handle this minor inconvenience. David took Cameron's card to the terminal. He returned moments later and shook his head. Declined. Cameron's face turned a violent shade of red. He began arguing with David, pointing aggressively at the terminal and then at his phone screen. I knew exactly why the cards were bouncing. Cameron's business was a hollow shell, and my father had likely overextended his own credit lines, trying to keep up appearances. David remained perfectly calm and professional, an immovable wall of hospitality standards. He pointed down at the bill, shaking his head firmly. The rest of the extended family finally realized the severity of the situation. Aunts and uncles began frantically checking their own wallets, whispering furiously to each other. Purses were dumped onto the mahogany table. Crumbled $20 bills and low-limit credit cards were pushed toward the center in a desperate, frantic pile, but none of them had the funds to cover a nearly $4,000 dinner. They had all come expecting a free ride, assuming my parents were wealthy enough to foot the bill, or that I would be bullied into paying it. Now they were trapped in a private dining room with no way out. I saw David pull a small radio from his belt and speak into it. He was following my instructions to the letter. He was calling the police. My car arrived at the curb. I thanked the valet, tipped him generously, and slid into the quiet sanctuary of the driver's seat. I pulled away from the Monarch, just as the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser turned onto the street, heading directly toward the restaurant entrance. The neon lights reflected brightly against the restaurant glass windows, illuminating the absolute chaos unfolding inside. I merged onto the highway, letting the smooth hum of the engine wash over me. For the first time in my life, my chest did not feel tight with anxiety after interacting with my family. I felt remarkably light. I felt entirely in control. 10 minutes into the drive, my phone connected to the car Bluetooth system. It began to vibrate continuously against the center console. The screen lit up with a rapid-fire barrage of text messages. The notifications flashed across my dashboard display in quick succession. Patricia, Mom, where are you? The restaurant is refusing to let us leave. Patricia. Mom, Vanessa, come back right now and pay this bill. Patricia, Mom. The police are here. How could you do this to us? I kept my eyes on the road and let the messages pile up. My aunt sent a frantic message demanding I return and take responsibility for my poor elderly parents. My father sent a string of furious demands, threatening to disown me again and ruin my life. I ignored them all. Then the text messages stopped, replaced by an audio notification. It was a voice note from Cameron. I tapped the screen to play the message through the car speakers. Cameron's voice blasted through the pristine audio system. He was not using his fake, sophisticated business tone. He was screaming, his voice raw with absolute panic and unrestrained rage. In the background, I could hear the distinct crackle of a police radio and the heavy slam of a metal door. "You are dead, Vanessa!" he shrieked, his voice breaking. "We got arrested! They literally put us in handcuffs for defrauding an innkeeper. Mom is crying in the back of a squad car because of you. Dad is calling his lawyers right now. He is going to sue you for everything you own. He is going to garnish your wages, you worthless cook. You are going to pay for this." The audio cut out with a sharp click. The silence returned to the interior of my car. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. Defrauding an innkeeper was a serious offense in this city, especially for a bill of that magnitude. They would be spending the night in a holding cell, stripped of their designer clothes and their inflated egos. My father's empty threats about lawyers and garnishing my wages meant absolutely nothing to me. He thought I was a vulnerable catering assistant making minimum wage. He had no idea he was declaring war against the chief executive officer of the very hospitality group that owned the restaurant that just had him arrested. They wanted to destroy me financially, but they had just walked blindly into their own spectacular ruin. The game had finally begun, and I held every single winning card. The morning sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse apartment, casting long, elegant shadows across the hardwood floor. I woke up feeling more rested than I had in half a decade. I poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee and finally unlocked my phone, which I had set to silent the night before. The lock screen was a solid wall of angry red notifications. I had 72 missed calls, 48 voicemails, and over 100 text messages. My mother, Patricia, had apparently been very busy since the moment the precinct released her husband and golden child son. I sat at my kitchen island and tapped the first notification. It was a link to a local community Facebook group. The video loaded immediately. There was my mother sitting in the passenger seat of what looked like a rideshare vehicle. Her hair was deliberately disheveled. Her makeup was expertly smudged under her eyes to give the illusion that she had been weeping for hours. She looked directly into the camera lens with a masterful expression of absolute profound heartbreak. I wanted to share a warning with our wonderful community. She began, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. Last night, my husband and I experienced every parent's worst nightmare. Our estranged daughter Vanessa reached out begging to reconnect. She invited us to a lovely dinner, telling us she wanted to finally make amends for her past mistakes. We went with open hearts. We even brought her brother Cameron, who just wanted his sister back. I took a slow sip of my coffee watching her perform. Patricia wiped away a fake tear and continued her tragic monologue. We sat down to eat, and she ordered the most expensive items on the menu. She told us she was celebrating a promotion at her little catering job. We were so proud of her. But then when the bill came, she excused herself to use the restroom. She never came back. She sneaked out the back door and left us completely stranded. My husband is a senior citizen with a heart condition. When he tried to explain the situation, the restaurant management was utterly ruthless. They called the police. My wonderful husband and my innocent son were brutalized. They were placed in handcuffs like common criminals and dragged away in front of everyone. We spent the entire night in a freezing holding cell, terrified and humiliated. Please beware of sociopathic behavior even from your own flesh and blood. The video had already amassed thousands of views and hundreds of outraged comments. The local suburban housewives who thrived on community drama were eating out of the palm of her hand. They were calling me a monster, a scam artist, and a disgrace to my family. But the public comments were nothing compared to the private voicemails left by my extended family. I pressed play on the first voicemail. It was my aunt complaining loudly about how I had irreparably damaged the family reputation. "You are a disgusting little girl," my aunt spat into the receiver. "Your mother is inconsolable. Your father's blood pressure is through the roof. You are going to pay them back for the bail money, and you are going to post a public apology immediately." The next voicemail was from a cousin I had not spoken to since high school. "Who do you think you are doing that to, Uncle Richard? Cameron missed an important morning meeting because he was sitting in jail. You are going to wire them $50,000 for emotional distress, or we are all going to court to testify against you." Message after message followed the exact same aggressive script. They demanded immediate apologies. They demanded substantial financial restitution for the bail money Patricia had to scrape together. They demanded I beg for forgiveness on my knees. They were operating under the fundamental delusion that I still cared about their toxic social circle. They truly believed their collective anger would somehow intimidate me into submission. I deleted every single voicemail without a second thought. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or panic. I felt nothing but a cold, calculating sense of validation. The smear campaign was exactly the kind of unhinged retaliatory tactic I expected from Patricia. She needed to control the narrative because the reality of her husband and son being arrested for credit card fraud was too deeply humiliating to accept. She needed to make me the villain to preserve her carefully curated status among her superficial friends. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug, and walked into my expansive walk-in closet to select my armor for the day. I chose a perfectly tailored charcoal gray power suit paired with a crisp white silk blouse and black stiletto heels. I accessorized with a subtle diamond pendant and a minimalist luxury watch. I looked exactly like the executive I was. I left my penthouse and took the private elevator down to the secure parking garage. My driver was waiting next to my black town car, holding the rear door open for me. I slid into the plush leather seat and opened my laptop to begin reviewing the daily financial reports for my hospitality group. The chaos of my family felt a million miles away. My corporate headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek glass skyscraper in the center of the downtown financial district. The building was a fortress of modern design and impenetrable security. As my car pulled up to the private executive entrance, the building security guards immediately cleared a path. I walked through the sliding glass doors and stepped into the expansive marble lobby. The atmosphere here was entirely different from the chaotic, messy world my family inhabited. Here, everything was orderly, professional, and highly controlled. Here, I was not the disappointing daughter or the worthless cook. I was the chief executive officer. I swiped my security badge at the private executive turnstile and stepped into the express elevator that went directly to the top floor. The elevator doors opened to reveal the reception area of my corporate suite. The walls were adorned with modern art, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the entire city skyline. This was my sanctuary. This was the empire I had built entirely on my own, while my family spent 5 years mocking my existence and predicting my inevitable failure. They thought I was barely surviving in a small administrative cubicle somewhere. They had absolutely no concept of the magnitude of my actual reality. I walked past the reception desk and gave a warm smile to my executive assistant, Megan. She was a brilliant, highly efficient woman who managed my schedule with absolute precision. She stood up immediately as I approached her desk, holding a sleek silver tablet tightly against her chest. "Good morning, Vanessa," Megan said. Her tone was strictly professional, but I could see a faint trace of underlying tension in her posture. "We have a rather urgent situation developing downstairs in the main public lobby." I paused, setting my leather briefcase down on the edge of her desk. "What kind of situation, Megan?" Megan tapped the screen of her tablet and brought up the live feed from the building security cameras. "Two men entered the main lobby about 10 minutes ago," she explained, keeping her voice low and steady. "They bypassed the visitor registration desk and attempted to force their way through the security turnstiles. When the guards stopped them, they became extremely hostile and belligerent. They are currently shouting at the lobby staff and causing a significant public disturbance." I looked down at the high-definition video feed playing on the tablet screen. Even without audio, the aggressive, erratic body language was unmistakable. It was my father Richard and my golden child, brother Cameron. They looked absolutely terrible. Their clothes were wrinkled and disheveled, clearly the same suits they had worn to the restaurant the night before. Cameron's suit jacket was missing a button, and his tie was hanging loosely around his neck. My father's face was bright red with fury as he pointed an aggressive finger directly into the chest of a massive security guard. They looked exactly like two men who had spent an agonizing, humiliating night sitting on a cold bench in a downtown holding cell. They looked desperate, angry, and dangerously out of control. "They are demanding to see you." Megan continued, pulling my attention back from the video feed. "They gave the guards your name and insisted they have an appointment, which they obviously do not. When the guards told them they needed proper authorization to access the executive floors, the older man completely lost his temper. He started shouting that he is your father and that he is going to make sure you are fired by the end of the day. He is currently threatening to drag the building management into a massive lawsuit if they do not let him upstairs immediately. The younger man is threatening to call the corporate board of directors to report you for criminal behavior." I stared at the tablet screen, watching my father pace back and forth across the marble lobby like a caged, furious animal. They had actually tracked me down to the corporate address associated with my business filings. They had marched into a multi-million-dollar commercial skyscraper, fully intending to bully a low-level manager into submitting to their demands. They truly believed they held the power to destroy my career by throwing a loud, embarrassing tantrum in the middle of a corporate lobby. They thought the threat of being fired would force me to run downstairs sobbing and hand them a check for $50,000. Megan looked at me with clear professional concern. "Security is requesting your authorization to physically remove them from the premises and issue a formal trespass warning. They have already threatened violence against the lobby staff. Should I tell them to proceed with the removal, or would you prefer I call the police to handle the disturbance?" I watched Cameron slam his fist against the visitor registration desk, demanding to speak to my boss. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. They wanted to speak to the person in charge. They wanted to ruin my pitiful career. I reached out and gently closed the cover of Megan's tablet. Do not call the police just yet, Megan, I instructed, my voice perfectly calm and terrifyingly smooth. And tell security to stand down. I want you to grant them temporary access to the building. Send them up to the secondary administrative meeting room on the 30th floor. I think it is time I finally speak to them. Let them believe they have won. Let them think they are about to get exactly what they want. Megan nodded crisply, her professional demeanor unwavering. Right away, Vanessa. I picked up my briefcase and walked toward my expansive corner office. My family wanted a war. They had survived their night in jail and immediately chosen to double down on their aggression, marching into my territory with demands and threats. They were about to discover that the daughter they thought they could easily intimidate no longer existed. They were about to step into the administrative meeting room and realize they had kicked a sleeping dragon. I walked into my private office and set my briefcase down on the massive glass desk. The room was silent, insulated from the noise of the city by thick soundproof glass. I walked over to the window and looked out at the sprawling metropolis below. My father and brother were currently riding the elevator up to the 30th floor, completely unaware that they were ascending into the heart of my empire. They thought they were taking an elevator to a tiny cubicle farm to terrorize a helpless employee. They had no idea they were walking blindly into a slaughterhouse. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit and took a deep, centering breath. The smear campaign on Facebook, the vicious voicemails from my extended family, and the aggressive ambush in my corporate lobby were all predictable tactics from people who had never been held accountable for their toxic actions. But their reign of unchecked manipulation was officially over. I turned away from the panoramic view of the skyline and walked toward the heavy oak doors of my office. It was time to deal with the intruders. It was time to let Richard and Cameron dig their own graves. I walked out of my expansive executive suite and down the heavily carpeted hallway toward the secondary administrative meeting room. This particular room was intentionally designed to be unremarkable. It had no windows, no sweeping views of the city skyline, and no expensive artwork on the walls. It contained only a basic laminate conference table and 6 standard office chairs. It was exactly the kind of sterile corporate environment where my father and brother would expect a low-level manager to spend her days. I sat down at the head of the table, clasped my hands together, and waited. The heavy wooden door flew open with such violent force that the handle slammed loudly against the drywall. Cameron marched into the room first, followed closely by my father. They both looked absolutely unhinged. The arrogant swagger they usually carried had been entirely replaced by a desperate, aggressive energy. Cameron marched straight to the conference table and slammed both of his hands down flat onto the laminate surface, leaning over to glare at me. "You are going to write us a check for $50,000 right now," Cameron demanded, his voice echoing harshly in the small, windowless room. "You are going to pay us back for the bail money, the legal fees, and the massive emotional distress you caused us last night. You are going to fix this, Vanessa, or I swear to God I will ruin your life." I did not flinch. I did not lean back in my chair. I simply looked up at him, maintaining a perfectly blank expression. "You spent the night in a holding cell because you attempted to defraud a restaurant," I replied, my voice calm and measured. "You ordered food and wine you could not afford. That is a criminal offense, Cameron. It has absolutely nothing to do with me." My father stepped forward, his face contorted with absolute fury. "Do not you dare speak to your brother that way," Richard shouted, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "You set us up. You invited us to that dinner, and then you abandoned us like a coward. You humiliated me in front of our entire family. We sat in a filthy jail cell with common criminals while you probably went home and laughed. You owe us this money, Vanessa. You owe us for the damage you have done to our reputation in this city." "Your reputation was ruined the second your credit cards declined," I pointed out smoothly. "I am not writing you a check for $50,000. I am not writing you a check for $5. You made your bed and now you get to sleep in it." Cameron let out a loud, bitter laugh, shaking his head in mock disbelief. He stood up straight and looked around the basic, sterile meeting room with undisguised contempt. Look at this place, he sneered, gesturing broadly at the blank walls. You actually think you are in a position to deny us anything? You are sitting in a pathetic little box pushing papers for some faceless corporation. I bet you barely make enough to cover your rent. You think you are so smart, but you are nothing, Vanessa. You are just a disposable employee. I let him talk. I let him build his false sense of superiority. He needed to believe I was powerless, because the reality of his own failure was clearly eating him alive inside. If you do not transfer that money into my account by noon today, I am going to walk out of this sad little room and go straight up to the executive suite, Cameron threatened, leaning over the table again. I am going to find whoever runs this company, and I am going to tell them exactly what kind of person you really are. I will tell them you are a criminal who sets up elderly people and steals from her own family. I will cause a massive public scene right in the middle of their beautiful lobby. I will make sure you are fired before you even have time to pack up your cheap little desk. Your pitiful career will be over. I stared at him, letting the absolute absurdity of his threat hang in the air. He was standing inside a building I effectively controlled, threatening to report me to myself. The delicious irony of the situation was almost intoxicating. You are welcome to try Cameron, I said softly, offering him a cold, tight smile. But I highly doubt anyone in the executive suite will care about the delusional ramblings of a man currently facing criminal charges for credit card fraud. My father lost whatever small shred of self-control he had left. He slammed his fist onto the conference table so hard the entire structure shook. You ungrateful, vicious little girl! Richard screamed, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. You owe your brother. He is the only one keeping this family afloat right now. We needed that dinner to impress his new investors. We needed to show them we are a wealthy, successful family. You ruined everything. The room suddenly fell deathly silent. Cameron whipped his head around to stare at our father, his eyes wide with absolute sheer panic. He looked completely horrified. Richard realized his massive mistake the very second the words left his mouth, but it was already too late. He had said the quiet part out loud. He had just handed me the missing piece of the puzzle on a silver platter. I sat perfectly still, processing the magnitude of my father's accidental confession. My mind worked with lightning speed, analyzing the information. Cameron was the only one keeping the family afloat. They needed the dinner to impress new investors. The facade of the wealthy, successful venture capitalist was completely fake. Cameron firm was not thriving. It was actively drowning. They had orchestrated the massive, expensive dinner at the Monarch specifically to project an illusion of extreme wealth to potential financial backers who must have been sitting at a nearby table. They needed to look like billionaires to secure new funding because they were secretly broke. Well, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous quiet whisper. That is incredibly revealing. It seems your highly successful venture capital firm is actually running on empty. Cameron. How embarrassing for you. Shut up! Cameron snapped, his voice trembling with genuine fear. You do not know what you are talking about. My firm is doing millions in revenue. We are acquiring new assets every single day. Dad just misspoke because he is stressed. No, I do not think he misspoke at all, I replied, standing up slowly from my chair. I think he finally told the truth. You are desperate, Cameron. Both of you are. You barged into my office building demanding $50,000 because you literally have no other way to pay your legal fees. You are completely bankrupt. My father took a step toward me, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. You listen to me, you worthless cook, he growled, taking another aggressive step forward. You are going to give us that money right now, or I swear I will make you regret the day you were born. I did not retreat. I simply reached under the edge of the conference table and pressed the silent panic button mounted directly beneath the laminate surface. I had required these buttons to be installed in every single meeting room on the executive floors for emergency situations exactly like this one. I have given you 5 years of peace, Richard, I said, dropping the title of father entirely. I stayed away. I built my own life. I asked nothing of you. But you decided to invite me to dinner specifically to humiliate me and force me to fund your pathetic fake lifestyle. You brought this disaster upon yourselves. The heavy wooden door to the meeting room swung open. 4 massive security guards stepped into the room, instantly filling the small space with their imposing physical presence. They wore crisp black suits and earpieces, looking directly at me for instructions. "These 2 men are trespassing," I said, my voice echoing with total, unquestionable authority. "They have threatened me, and they are attempting to extort money. I want them physically escorted out of this building immediately. They are permanently banned from the premises. If they ever step foot on this property again, you have my full authorization to have them arrested for trespassing." My father looked at the security guards and then back at me, his expression shifting to complete confusion. "What is going on?" he demanded, looking around the room. "Why are they listening to you? You are just an administrative assistant. Tell them to back off." Cameron tried to push past the largest security guard, but the man simply grabbed Cameron by the shoulder and shoved him firmly backward toward the door. "Do not touch me!" Cameron yelled, struggling against the guard's solid grip. "I am a wealthy investor. I will have your job for this. I will sue this entire building." "Escort them out," I repeated coldly, turning my back on them and gathering my things. The guards moved with swift, brutal efficiency. They grabbed my father and brother by their arms and physically forced them out of the meeting room. I could hear them shouting and cursing as they were dragged down the hallway toward the freight elevator. Their voices echoed loudly, fading only when the heavy elevator doors finally slid shut behind them. I stood alone in the quiet, sterile meeting room. The aggressive, chaotic energy they had brought with them slowly dissipated, leaving behind a cold, sharp sense of absolute clarity. I walked out of the room and headed back down the hallway toward my private corner office. I bypassed Megan's desk, giving her a brief, reassuring nod, and stepped into my sanctuary, closing the heavy oak doors securely behind me. I walked over to my desk and sat down in my plush leather executive chair. The silence of the room wrapped around me, but my mind was racing with terrifying speed. Richard's careless words repeated over and over in my head like a warning siren. "He is the only one keeping this family afloat. We needed that dinner to impress new investors." Cameron was completely broke. His venture capital firm was a massive failing charade, but the luxurious lifestyle they had been flaunting, the designer suits, the platinum credit cards, the expensive cars, none of that came cheap. If Cameron business was bankrupt, how had they been funding their extravagant fake millionaire lifestyle for the past several months? Desperate people do incredibly dangerous things. They cut corners, they break the law, they steal. A massive, terrifying red flag went up in my mind. If my family was facing total financial ruin and they were arrogant enough to try and extort $50,000 from me in the middle of a corporate building, they were capable of much worse. I needed to know exactly how deep their financial hole truly went. I needed to see the raw data. I reached across my glass desk, picked up my phone, and immediately dialed the direct private number for my lead corporate attorney. He answered on the second ring. "We have a major problem," I said, skipping the pleasantries entirely. "My brother venture capital firm is secretly bankrupt, but he is still spending money like a millionaire. I need you to run a deep, extensive background check on his business and my father's personal finances. Dig into everything. Uncover their debts, their loans, and their hidden assets. I need to know exactly how they are surviving right now because they just tried to extort me for $50,000. I hung up the phone and looked out at the sprawling city skyline below. The war had officially escalated, and I was not going to wait for their next attack. I was going to unearth every single secret they had left. I stared at the document resting on the polished surface of my desk. The numbers, printed in stark black ink, blurred slightly as my brain struggled to process the magnitude of the betrayal. $500,000. $500,000 tied directly to my name, my social security number, and my pristine credit history. The room, which just moments ago had felt like an impenetrable fortress of my own making, suddenly felt suffocatingly small. My lead corporate attorney Marcus sat across from me, his usually impassive face etched with deep professional concern. "This is a commercial loan document," Marcus explained, his voice calm but tight with underlying tension. "It was executed exactly 90 days ago." The primary borrower is listed as Cameron Venture Capital Firm, but the secondary guarantor, the CO signer, holding ultimate financial liability if the business defaults, is listed as you, Vanessa. I reached out and picked up the heavy stack of paper. The signature on the bottom line was a masterful forgery. It mimicked the distinctive loops and angles of my handwriting almost perfectly, but I knew with absolute certainty that my hand had never touched this document. I had not spoken to my brother in 5 years. I did not even know the name of his fake venture capital firm until last night. How is this even possible? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. I have fraud alerts on all my personal accounts. My credit is locked down tighter than a bank vault because of my corporate acquisitions. How did they manage to secure a commercial loan of this size without tripping a single security alarm? Marcus pulled a secondary file from his leather briefcase and opened it. That is where this situation elevates from simple identity theft to highly sophisticated wire fraud, he said, pointing to a specific highlighted paragraph. They did not just forge your signature, Vanessa. They created a deeply elaborate financial illusion. According to the metadata we pulled from the bank digital portal, the loan application was submitted from an IP address registered to your father home network. They used your childhood banking details, the original account your parents set up for you when you were a teenager, which you never officially closed out. They linked that dormant account to the loan application to verify your identity and bypass the initial credit checks. The sheer calculation involved in their scheme was breathtaking. They had not just acted out of sudden panic. They had carefully, methodically planned to steal my identity and anchor their sinking ship to my financial stability. They used the information they had hoarded from my childhood to systematically bypass modern security protocols. My father, the man who loved to preach about family loyalty and honor, had actively colluded with my golden child brother to commit federal fraud. The bank is currently showing the loan as 90 days past due. Marcus continued, leaning forward and clasping his hands together. Cameron Firm has not made a single payment since the funds were dispersed. The bank is preparing to initiate aggressive collection protocols. If this loan defaults, they will not go after Cameron Bankrupt Shell Company. They will come directly after you, Vanessa. They will attempt to seize your personal assets, freeze your corporate accounts, and potentially place a lien against your hospitality group. The sudden extortion attempt in my office lobby suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. They did not just want $50,000 to cover their legal fees from the restaurant arrest. They needed that exact amount to cover the 90-day past due balance on the fraudulent commercial loan. They were desperately trying to steal from me to pay off the bank they had already defrauded using my name. They were attempting to force me to finance the cover-up of their own massive crime. I placed the forged loan document back onto the glass desk and took a slow, deliberate breath. The initial shock was rapidly fading, replaced by a cold, calculating rage that burned brighter than anything I had ever experienced. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial warfare. They had assumed I would panic cry and quietly pay the debt to avoid a messy public family scandal. They vastly underestimated the woman sitting across from them. "What are our immediate legal options?" I asked, locking eyes with Marcus. "We have a few paths," Marcus replied immediately, shifting into crisis management mode. "The standard procedure is to immediately file a police report for identity theft and wire fraud. We contact the bank providing sworn affidavits that you did not authorize this loan. We initiate a massive federal investigation. However, if we trigger a federal fraud investigation right now, the ensuing media circus could be incredibly damaging. Your hospitality group is currently finalizing the acquisition of 3 major international properties. If the financial press catches wind that the CEO is embroiled in a $500,000 fraud scandal, even as a victim, it could spook the investors and derail the entire acquisition. My family was relying on that exact vulnerability. They knew my public reputation was my most valuable asset. They were banking on my silence. They assumed I would simply eat the loss and pay off the loan to protect my corporate empire from bad publicity. "I am not paying a single cent of this fraudulent debt," I stated, my voice hard as steel. "And I am not letting them drag my company into a media circus. We need a strategy that neutralizes the threat completely without exposing my hospitality group to collateral damage. Marcus nodded slowly, a small grim smile touching the corners of his mouth. I agree. The best defense is a devastating offense. We need to gather undeniable, irrefutable proof of their fraud before we go to the authorities. We need to trap them in a lie so massive they cannot possibly spin their way out of it. I leaned back in my executive chair, letting my mind race through the possibilities. My family was desperate. Cameron firm was bankrupt and the bank was closing in. They needed a massive influx of real capital immediately to keep their fraudulent lifestyle afloat. They needed new wealthy investors to buy into their fake millionaire facade. Where are they going next, I asked. What is their next move to secure funding? Marcus opened his laptop and tapped a few keys, bringing up a digital calendar. My private investigator has been tracking their movements since the incident at the Monarch last night, he said, turning the screen toward me. They have been desperately trying to secure invitations to high society networking events. According to our sources, they just managed to bribe a mid-level promoter to get their names added to the VIP guest list for a major event this Saturday night. I leaned forward, reading the details on the screen. It was the highly anticipated VIP grand opening of Aura, the city's newest and most exclusive luxury resort and restaurant. It was an event designed specifically to attract billionaires, elite investors, and city socialites. It was the perfect hunting ground for two desperate men trying to pitch a fake venture capital firm to unsuspecting wealthy targets. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face as I read the name of the venue. Aura was not just a luxury resort. It was the crown jewel of my current expansion project. My hospitality group owned the entire property. The VIP grand opening was an event I had personally orchestrated down to the smallest detail. My father and brother had just bribed their way into a building I completely controlled. They are walking right into my trap, I said softly, feeling a surge of absolute predatory satisfaction. They think they are going to Ur to secure funding and save their fraudulent empire. They have no idea who actually owns the venue. Marcus raised an eyebrow, catching on to my line of thinking immediately. You are hosting the grand opening, he asked. I am the mysterious founder and CEO the press has been buzzing about, I confirmed. I have deliberately kept my name out of the promotional materials to build anticipation for the reveal. My family is going to walk into that ballroom expecting to mingle with billionaires. Instead, they are going to come face to face with the daughter they just tried to destroy. We have 3 days until the event, Marcus noted, closing his laptop. What do you want to do about the fraudulent loan in the meantime? Nothing, I instructed firmly. Maintain absolute radio silence. Do not contact the bank. Do not respond to my mother's smear campaign on Facebook. Do not block their phone numbers, but do not answer their calls. Let them sit in the dark and panic. Let them believe their extortion attempt failed, and their only hope is securing new investors at the Aura grand opening. Marcus nodded, taking detailed notes. I will coordinate with a private investigator. We need to secure the original IP logs from the bank loan application and definitively trace the flow of the $500,000. I want to know exactly which offshore accounts Cameron moved that money into. I want everything documented perfectly, Marcus, I said, standing up from my desk. When I drop the hammer on Saturday night, I want it to be a fatal blow. I want the federal subpoenas drafted, printed, and ready to be served on a silver platter. They want to play the part of wealthy, successful businessmen in front of the city elite. I'm going to give them the grandest stage possible for their complete and total public destruction. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city below. The war had escalated beyond petty family squabbles and nasty voicemails. My family had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They had committed a massive federal crime using my name, and they had done it with the arrogant assumption that I would quietly clean up their mess. They were about to learn that the woman they abandoned 5 years ago was no longer a victim. She was the architect of their absolute ruin. The moment Marcus walked out of my executive office, I initiated a complete and total communication blackout. I did not block my family phone numbers or their social media accounts. Blocking them would signal that their harassment was actively affecting me. It would show them that I was retreating. I wanted them to know that I was receiving every single one of their messages and actively choosing to ignore them. I placed my personal cell phone face up on the pristine glass surface of my desk and watched as the notifications poured in like a digital avalanche. The strategy of absolute silence was the most potent psychological weapon I possessed. My family had spent my entire life conditioning me to respond to their anger with immediate frantic apologies. They operated on a strict dynamic of action and reaction. They threw a tantrum and I was supposed to scramble to appease them. By refusing to play my assigned role, I was completely dismantling their reality. My mother, Patricia, escalated her public smear campaign almost immediately when I did not respond to her initial demands for $50,000. She took to her suburban community Facebook groups with a renewed sense of vicious determination. The carefully curated image of the heartbroken mother quickly morphed into the aggressive stance of a victimized elder. She posted lengthy, fabricated stories about how I had allegedly stolen money from her purse when I was a teenager, attempting to establish a lifelong pattern of criminal behavior to justify my supposed dine and dash at the Monarch. She tagged her sisters and local church members, rallying an army of bored housewives to leave scathing reviews on random catering business pages she incorrectly assumed I owned. I sat in my luxurious penthouse suite sipping vintage tea and calmly reading every single comment. It was fascinating to watch her spin completely out of control. Her posts became increasingly erratic and desperate as the hours ticked by without a single word of rebuttal from me. My father and brother took a much darker and more aggressive approach. Richard sent a barrage of text messages that shifted wildly in tone. At first, they were commanding and authoritative, demanding, "I call him back this instant," to resolve the situation like an adult. When I did not reply, the texts became vicious threats about ruining my reputation and sending his high-powered lawyers to crush me. By the second day of total silence, a creeping paranoia began to bleed into his messages. He demanded to know who I was speaking to and what I was planning. He hated the silence. It stripped him of his perceived power. Cameron was even worse. He left furious voicemails that I transcribed using an automated software program just to keep a clean legal record. He screamed into the receiver, calling me every derogatory name imaginable, warning me that I had no idea who I was messing with. But beneath the bluster, I could hear the unmistakable tremor of sheer panic in his voice. They were drowning in the quiet void I had created. While they wasted their energy screaming into the void, I was quietly assembling an elite strike force of legal and financial experts. Marcus brought in a top-tier forensic accountant named David and a ruthless private investigator named Cole, who specialized in unraveling complex corporate fraud. I gave them unlimited resources and absolute clearance to tear my family financial history down to the bare studs. We transformed my secondary corporate boardroom into a secure war room. For 3 solid days, David and Cole worked around the clock tracking the digital footprints my arrogant brother had carelessly left behind. Cameron thought he was a criminal mastermind, but he had executed his scheme with the sloppy overconfidence of a man who believed he would never be caught. The forensic analysis of the $500,000 commercial loan was completely devastating. David traced the initial application directly to the IP address of the router, sitting in my parents' suburban living room. Cameron had not even bothered to use a secure network or a virtual private network to mask his location. He had simply sat on his childhood bed, logged onto my father's wireless network, and committed federal wire fraud. David also pulled the digital signature logs and matched the timestamps to a period when I could definitively prove I was leading a board meeting in another state, surrounded by 30 corporate witnesses. The forgery was entirely undeniable, but the most damning evidence came from tracking the actual movement of the stolen funds. Cole, the private investigator, used his extensive network of financial contacts to follow the money trail after the bank disbursed the $500,000 into Cameron's business account. The money did not stay in the venture capital firm for more than 48 hours. Cameron immediately began funneling the capital through a series of poorly constructed domestic shell companies. He was attempting to wash the funds to make them look like legitimate investment returns. Cole walked into the war room on the evening of the third day and dropped a thick, heavy physical dossier directly onto the conference table. The loud thud echoed in the quiet room, signaling the end of the investigation and the beginning of my retribution. I opened the manila folder and began reading the meticulously compiled report. The depths of Cameron's financial depravity were staggering. He had not used the loan to save his failing business. He had transferred nearly $300,000 into hidden offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands to protect the cash from his rapidly accumulating domestic creditors. The remaining $200,000 had been systematically drained to fund the illusion of his massive wealth. Cole provided bank statements and photographic evidence detailing exactly how my brother had been spending the stolen money. He used my name and my credit to lease a fleet of luxury sports cars. He paid for his wife's expensive country club memberships. He bought the tailored designer suits he wore to the Monarch to mock my modest dress. He even used the fraudulent funds to pay the retainer for the high-priced defense attorney who had bailed him out of jail after the restaurant incident. My brother was literally using the money he stole from me to fund his legal defense against the crimes he committed while trying to extort me. The sheer audacity of his actions was almost difficult to comprehend. "We have everything we need to bury them under the federal penitentiary," Marcus said, reviewing the final pages of the dossier. "The evidence of wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering is absolutely airtight. The bank will immediately initiate criminal proceedings the second we hand this over to their fraud department. We can pull the trigger right now, Vanessa." I closed the dossier and rested my hands flat on top of the smooth cardboard cover. The urge to end it immediately was incredibly strong, but I needed this to be completely absolute. I needed to ensure they could never spin this narrative to make themselves look like the victims of a cruel misunderstanding. If I simply handed the file to the police, they would claim I was a vindictive daughter ruining a simple family business error. I needed a public stage. I needed them to corner themselves so thoroughly that no amount of public relations spin could ever save them. "What is their current status?" I asked, turning my attention to Cole. "How are they reacting to the silence and the impending default on the loan?" Cole pulled a secondary file from his jacket pocket. "They are in full-blown panic mode," he reported, his voice low and professional. "The bank sent a final notice of default to Cameron business address yesterday morning. They have 72 hours to produce a massive capital injection, or the bank seizes the assets and discovers the offshore transfers. Richard and Cameron have spent the last 48 hours aggressively cold-calling every wealthy contact in their phone books, begging for bridge loans and investment meetings. Everyone is turning them down because the rumors of their arrest at the Monarch have already poisoned their reputation in their immediate social circle." Cole tapped a specific page in the file. "But they are making one final desperate play to save themselves. They know their only chance is to secure funding from outside their current network. They need a billionaire investor who does not know about their current legal troubles. They have spent the last 24 hours calling in every favor and heavily bribing a mid-level event promoter to secure 2 VIP invitations to the biggest networking event of the year." I felt a sharp, cold thrill run down my spine as I anticipated his next words. "What event?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The grand opening of the Aura Luxury Resort and Restaurant," Cole confirmed. "It is scheduled for this Saturday night. The guest list is strictly billionaires, elite venture capitalists, and high society socialites. Cameron and Richard believe if they can just get into that ballroom, they can charm a wealthy investor into backing their fake firm and cover the stolen loan money before the bank completely collapses their house of cards. They are betting their entire freedom on this one single event." I let out a slow, genuine laugh that startled both Marcus and Cole. The absolute perfection of the situation was almost poetic. They were actively bribing their way into a building I completely owned and operated. They were planning to walk into my territory to pitch their fraudulent business to my personal colleagues and my trusted board of investors. They were desperately swimming toward a life raft that was actually a heavily armed battleship waiting to blow them out of the water. Do not interfere with their invitations. I ordered, my voice ringing with absolute finality. Let the promoter clear their names for the guest list. I want them to walk through those front doors on Saturday night, believing they have finally won. I want them to put on their stolen designer suits and drink expensive champagne. Let them bask in the illusion of their own brilliance for one final hour. I picked up the heavy dossier and locked it inside my personal briefcase. The strategic silence had worked perfectly. It had driven them straight into the trap of their own overwhelming hubris. They thought they were hunting for a wealthy savior to fix their massive mistakes. They had absolutely no idea they were marching directly into an execution completely designed and orchestrated by the daughter they had discarded. The city was absolutely buzzing with intense electric energy regarding the highly exclusive grand opening of Aura. This spectacular venue was not just another standard high-end restaurant. It was a sprawling, luxurious, ultra-modern resort built directly into the steep waterfront cliffs. The sheer glass walls flawlessly reflected the dark, crashing ocean waves below. The infinity pools appeared to magically drop off the edge of the world. For over 6 months, the local media had been heavily speculating about this breathtaking architectural triumph. The absolute secrecy surrounding the identity of the primary investor only further fueled the public obsession. The elite guest list was a tightly guarded fortress. No amount of standard wealth could buy a ticket into the grand ballroom tonight. You had to be personally invited by the highest executive board. My father and my brother, however, were entirely driven by the raw, unhinged desperation of cornered animals. They had spent the last 48 hours quietly liquidating the very last remnants of my mother's personal jewelry collection, just to scrape together enough liquid cash for a substantial bribe. My private investigator intercepted the communication logs, showing exactly how they managed to execute this pathetic, desperate scheme. Richard and Cameron had successfully found a mid-level events promoter who possessed limited access to the secondary guest registry. They secretly transferred $20,000 to this promoter simply to get their names added to the digital entry system. It was a pathetic, reckless gamble. They were literally spending the final pennies they had to their name just to step foot inside my building. From the secure command center located on the top floor of the Aura Resort, I comfortably watched their highly anticipated arrival on a massive bank of glowing high-definition security monitors displaying the front entrance. The camera feeds provided a crystal-clear view of the bustling valet stand and the grand main entrance. A sleek, rented black luxury sedan slowly pulled up to the illuminated curb. My father and brother confidently stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting their dark ties with practiced, arrogant swaggers. They were wearing extremely expensive designer tuxedos. The sharp cut of the Italian fabric and the subtle sheen of the dark silk lapels screamed immense wealth. But because I intimately knew their actual terrifying financial reality, I easily recognized the tiny paper barcode tags hastily tucked inside their starched white collars. The suits were cheap hourly rentals. They were wearing borrowed fragile armor to a sophisticated battlefield they fundamentally did not understand. As they approached the main glass entrance, their inherent toxic entitlement was immediately placed on full public display. A seasoned hospitality director politely asked them to present their digital invitations and physical identification. My father visibly bristled at the standard request. He puffed out his chest and spoke down to the dedicated staff member, gesturing aggressively with his hands. I watched him tap his expensive-looking fake watch, clearly implying that his precious time was far too valuable today. Cameron mirrored his aggressive, hostile posture, attempting to deeply intimidate the front door staff by loudly name-dropping several prominent local politicians he falsely claimed to know. They treated my highly trained staff like absolute disposable garbage, asserting a fake, fragile dominance to violently mask their underlying creeping panic. The hospitality director, maintaining perfect, flawless professional composure, quietly scanned their purchased credentials and allowed them to pass through the heavy velvet ropes. The moment they stepped into the massive grand ballroom, the hidden security cameras captured their physical reaction. The sheer magnificent scale and absolute breathtaking opulence completely stunned them. The ceiling was a stunning canopy of cascading crystal light fixtures that perfectly mimicked the glowing midnight stars. The expansive floor was cut from imported flawless black marble. Waiters in immaculate white uniforms circulated smoothly through the dense crowd, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with premium vintage champagne and exquisite culinary creations. The room was packed tightly with the most powerful, influential individuals in the entire state. Tech billionaires, elite real estate developers, and massive hedge fund managers stood in small, intimate circles holding quiet, powerful conversations that directly dictated the financial future of the surrounding regional economy here tonight. Richard and Cameron quickly snapped out of their momentary awe. They exchanged a fast, dark look of hungry, desperate determination. This was their absolute final chance to secure a massive influx of capital to prevent the ruthless federal bank from seizing Cameron's completely fraudulent business today. They grabbed 2 tall flutes of champagne from a passing waiter and immediately dove recklessly into the elite crowd. They targeted a small group of older established investors standing near the massive ice sculpture in the exact center of the room. I watched intently through the camera feed as Cameron interrupted their private conversation. He utilized his practiced, charming, charismatic smile, aggressively shaking hands and frantically passing out his premium heavy cardstock business cards. I quickly switched the secure audio feed to the hidden directional microphones positioned around the ballroom. Cameron's voice filtered clearly through the speakers in my command center, loud and dripping with false, obnoxious confidence. Our private venture capital firm is currently managing over $50 million in active liquid assets. He lied smoothly, leaning forward toward a prominent real estate mogul. We are currently looking to widely diversify our massive portfolio with some highly exclusive local commercial partnerships here today. We have a massive amount of liquid capital ready to deploy for the right unique opportunity. The older investors exchanged polite but extremely skeptical glances. True immense wealth in these exclusive circles was always quiet and highly unassuming. Cameron, aggressive, loud pitching reeked of absolute transparent desperation. He was blatantly violating every single unspoken rule of high society elite networking. My father stepped in, attempting to falsely validate Cameron's completely ridiculous claims. My son has the best financial instincts in the entire global industry, Richard boasted, clapping Cameron proudly and aggressively on the back while sipping his premium champagne flute. We just closed a massive tech acquisition last week. The quarterly returns are completely astronomical. We simply have too much capital sitting idle right now. The wealthy investors offered polite, non-committal nods and quickly found convenient excuses to walk away from the aggressive, desperate duo. Richard and Cameron did not let the subtle social rejection deter them. They immediately pivoted sharply and locked onto a brand new wealthy target. For the next exhausting hour, they aggressively stalked the perimeter of the grand ballroom, cornering anyone wearing an expensive luxury watch. They pitched their fake multi-million-dollar success story relentlessly. Their forced smiles grew increasingly rigid and frantic with each polite, quiet rejection. The sheer desperation was practically radiating from their sweating pores. They needed a massive check written tonight. They desperately needed someone to blindly buy into the grand illusion before the federal authorities kicked down their front door. Frustrated by their complete lack of immediate success, Cameron suddenly decided to change his strategy. He grabbed another full glass of champagne and marched directly over to the main concierge desk located near the grand sweeping staircase. The audio feed picked up his increasingly belligerent and highly demanding tone immediately. "I need to speak to the owner of this establishment," Cameron demanded, leaning heavily and aggressively against the smooth marble counter. "My venture capital firm is prepared to offer a highly lucrative exclusive partnership, but I only deal directly with the primary executive stakeholders. Tell your boss that Cameron is waiting in the VIP section, and I expect a private introduction immediately." The concierge offered a polite, practiced customer service smile. "The founder and CEO will be addressing the entire assembly shortly, sir," she replied smoothly. "All private introductions will be handled strictly after the main presentation concludes here tonight." My father stepped up closely beside Cameron, scowling deeply at the concierge. "You do not seem to understand who you are speaking to," Richard threatened, his voice low and incredibly nasty. "We are not just regular standard guests. We are elite, powerful investors. We do not wait in line with the rest of this common crowd. Bring the owner out here right now, or we will happily take our massive capital elsewhere." I sat back comfortably in my leather chair in the secure command center and let out a soft, chilling laugh. The absolute magnitude of their delusion was spectacular. The grand ballroom atmosphere suddenly shifted dramatically. The soft ambient jazz music smoothly faded into total absolute silence. The massive crystal chandeliers overhead dimmed instantly, casting the vast, beautiful space into a dramatic, expectant twilight. The low hum of elite conversation stopped as all eyes turned eagerly toward the grand, sweeping staircase. Twin bright spotlights illuminated a sleek, modern podium. The master of ceremonies announced that the enigmatic founder and CEO would now address the crowd. Richard and Cameron aggressively pushed their way to the very front row, holding their drinks completely ready to blindly network with their own executioner. The master of ceremonies stepped back from the sleek acrylic podium, allowing the dramatic silence to stretch across the vast room. High above the polished black marble floor, a single brilliant spotlight pierced the dim twilight of the ballroom. It illuminated the landing of the grand sweeping staircase. The orchestral music swelled to a triumphant crescendo. I took a slow, measured breath and stepped out of the shadows into the blinding cascade of light. The custom gown I wore was a masterpiece of architectural design, woven from midnight blue silk that shimmered like liquid sapphire under the intense lights. It possessed no loud logos or ostentatious patterns. It was the absolute embodiment of quiet, untouchable power. I began my descent down the wide, curved staircase, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a queen surveying her undisputed kingdom. A collective murmur of genuine awe rippled through the tightly packed crowd of elite investors and socialites. Below me, I could see the ocean of upturned faces watching my every move with rapt attention. And right there, in the very front row, standing shoulder to shoulder with the city's wealthiest power brokers, were my father, Richard, my brother, Cameron, and my mother, Patricia. Patricia had apparently squeezed her way to the front line, desperate to be seen near the wealthiest individuals in the room. From my elevated vantage point, I possessed the perfect view of their immediate psychological collapse. At first, they just squinted against the bright glare of the spotlight, trying to make out the features of the mysterious billionaire they were so desperate to network with. Then, as I reached the middle landing, the light caught my face perfectly. I saw the exact second the recognition registered in my brother's eyes. Cameron's jaw went completely slack. The expensive crystal champagne flute he was holding tilted dangerously in his trembling hand, spilling a few drops of premium vintage onto the expensive imported shoes he had rented for the evening. My mother, Patricia, physically recoiled, as if she had been struck by an invisible force. She grabbed my father's arm, her manicured fingernails digging desperately into the dark fabric of his rented tuxedo jacket. Richard's face drained of all color, instantly transforming from a mask of arrogant entitlement to a portrait of pure, unadulterated terror. They were staring at the daughter they had discarded, the woman they had relentlessly mocked as a worthless cook and a spectacular failure. They expected to see a desperate, struggling outcast. Instead, they were gazing up at the supreme architect of their absolute destruction. I reached the bottom of the grand staircase and walked smoothly across the black marble floor toward the podium. The crowd parted respectfully, allowing me to pass. I stepped up to the microphone and looked out over the sea of powerful individuals, deliberately letting my eyes lock onto my terrified family for one long, agonizing second. I offered them a cold, razor-sharp smile that promised absolute ruin before turning my attention to the rest of the room. "Good evening, distinguished guests. I began my voice projecting with flawless, unwavering confidence through the state-of-the-art sound system. My name is Vanessa, and I am the founder and chief executive officer of the Monarch Hospitality Group. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. I let the sound wash over me, basking in the undeniable reality of my hard-earned success. When the applause finally subsided, I continued my address. 5 years ago, I started this company with nothing but a singular, uncompromising vision to redefine the absolute pinnacle of luxury dining and resort experiences. I did not have generational wealth to rely upon. I did not have a family safety net to catch me if I failed. I built this empire entirely from scratch, relying purely on my own relentless determination and the incredible dedication of my executive team. I paused to let those specific words sink in, watching my family squirm in the front row. To them, my catering gig was a pathetic joke. They had completely convinced themselves I was living in squalor. Now they were being forced to stand in a room packed with actual billionaires and listen to me casually dismiss the very concept of their financial support. Tonight marks a monumental milestone for our corporate portfolio, I announced, gesturing broadly to the magnificent room surrounding us. Aura is the culmination of 3 years of intense development and hundreds of millions of dollars in strategic investment. But it is not our only recent triumph. I gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward slightly to deliver the next devastating piece of information. As many of you read in the financial journals this morning, Monarch Hospitality Group has officially finalized the aggressive hostile acquisition of several historic properties in the downtown district. I am incredibly proud to announce that we are now the sole owners and operators of the legendary establishment known as the Monarch. The room broke out into another round of enthusiastic applause. Investors nodded in deep approval of the aggressive corporate expansion. But the reaction from my family was entirely different. The revelation hit Richard, Patricia, and Cameron like a runaway freight train. I watched the profound, horrific realization detonate behind their eyes. They had mocked my career while eating Wagyu steaks at a restaurant I was in the process of acquiring. They had attempted to dine and dash, leaving a massive bill at an establishment I completely owned. The police had arrested them in a building that belonged entirely to me. I had not just called the police on my family. I had utilized my own corporate security protocols to have them dragged out of my own restaurant in handcuffs. The sheer psychological weight of their catastrophic mistake was visibly crushing them. They had marched into my corporate headquarters screaming demands and throwing wild tantrums. They had threatened to ruin my pitiful career by speaking to my boss completely unaware that I was the ultimate authority. They had attempted to extort $50,000 from a woman whose personal net worth dwarfed their wildest, most delusional fantasies. They were currently standing inside a multi-million-dollar resort that I built, drinking champagne that I paid for, surrounded by elite security guards who answered only to me. Cameron looked like he was going to be physically sick. His chest heaved as he took shallow, frantic breaths. The fake venture capital empire he had spent years pretending to build was absolutely nothing compared to the colossal reality of my actual achievements. He had spent his entire life positioned as the superior golden child. He had relentlessly bullied me for pursuing a creative passion rather than a rigid corporate path. Now he was a bankrupt fraud facing federal prison, and I was the undisputed titan of the city hospitality industry. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely permanently obliterated. Patricia appeared to be on the verge of a total nervous breakdown. Her eyes darted frantically around the grand ballroom, taking in the elite socialites and powerful politicians mingling happily in my venue. These were the exact same people she desperately wanted to impress. These were the high society figures she had lied to, spinning elaborate tales about my sociopathic behavior to cover up her own arrest. Now those same powerful figures were gazing up at me with absolute deep respect and profound admiration. Her entire social currency was entirely dependent on my downfall. Seeing me elevated to a position of supreme, untouchable power completely shattered her fragile narcissistic reality. I concluded my brief opening remarks by thanking my board of investors and inviting the guests to enjoy the premium amenities of the Aura Resort. The orchestral music smoothly transitioned back into a lively, sophisticated rhythm. Waiters resumed circulating with silver trays of champagne. The crowd began to disperse into smaller, intimate networking groups, buzzing excitedly about the massive acquisition announcements I had just delivered. I stepped down from the podium, moving gracefully to join the guests. My personal security detail immediately moved into position, forming a subtle but impenetrable perimeter around me. I accepted congratulations from several prominent hedge fund managers and a highly respected state senator. All the while, I kept my peripheral vision locked onto the front row where my family remained, completely paralyzed by shock. They were trapped in a severe state of cognitive dissonance. Their brains simply could not reconcile the pathetic scapegoat they had abused for decades with the powerful billionaire CEO currently dominating the room. Any rational human being in their position would have immediately recognized the immense danger they were in. A normal person would have felt a profound sense of shame and terror. They would have quietly turned around, slipped out the front doors, and fled into the night, praying I would not use my vast wealth and influence to destroy them. They had committed massive federal wire fraud using my identity. They were standing mere feet away from the woman who possessed the power to send them all to federal prison with a single phone call. Fleeing was their only logical option. But my family did not operate on standard human logic. They operated on a deep toxic foundation of absolute unchecked narcissism. I watched my father Richard physically shake off his initial shock. He stood up straighter, aggressively, adjusting the lapels of his cheap rented tuxedo. I could see the greedy gears turning rapidly inside his head. He looked around at the room full of billionaires who were actively clapping for me. He looked at the massive crystal chandeliers and the imported black marble floors. He did not see a daughter he had profoundly wronged. He saw an endless, bottomless bank account. In his deeply twisted mind, my success was simply an extension of his own greatness. He believed he was entitled to a piece of my empire simply because we shared the same last name. He completely ignored the 5 years of brutal silence. He conveniently forgot the fact that he had told me I owed him for raising me just days ago. He mentally erased the horrific smear campaign his wife was currently running on social media. Driven by pure, unadulterated greed and a desperate need to save himself from impending bankruptcy, Richard decided to play the ultimate delusional card. He stepped forward aggressively, pushing past a prominent real estate mogul to close the distance between us. He ignored the sudden tense shifting of my personal security detail, who immediately stepped forward to block his path. Richard did not care. He needed the room to know he was connected to the supreme power in the building. He needed these elite investors to believe he was part of my multi-million-dollar success story. It was his only chance to secure the funding he desperately needed to save Cameron's fraudulent failing business. Richard raised his nearly empty glass of champagne high into the air. He puffed out his chest and plastered a massive fake beaming smile across his face. He turned toward the group of highly influential billionaires standing directly next to him, ensuring his voice was loud enough to carry over the sophisticated jazz music playing in the background. He wanted everyone in our immediate vicinity to hear his absolute blatant lie. "That is my brilliant daughter," Richard proclaimed, his voice booming with artificial pride and staggering arrogance. "We taught her everything she knows about business. We supported her vision from the very beginning. We are so incredibly proud of the empire we built together." The sheer audacity of my father's bold declaration hung in the opulent air of the grand ballroom like a toxic fog. He stood there with his chest puffed out, and his rented tuxedo catching the light, projecting the absolute falsehood of a proud, supportive parent. The group of elite billionaires and prominent real estate moguls standing directly adjacent to him turned their heads, looking between Richard and me with mild curiosity. They were politely waiting to see how I would acknowledge the man claiming to be the primary architect of my massive hospitality empire. Richard smiled at them, a greedy, desperate grin that practically begged for their immediate financial investment. He truly believed he had checkmated me in public. He assumed that because we were standing in front of the most powerful and influential individuals in the entire state, I would be forced to play along with his delusional charade to avoid a messy public scandal. He thought I would quietly accept his fabricated narrative and allow him to attach his sinking bankrupt ship to my pristine luxury brand. I did not smile. I did not nod. I did not offer the polite diplomatic response that a typical corporate executive might use to quietly diffuse an awkward social interaction. Instead, I turned around and walked slowly right back up the bottom steps of the grand marble staircase. I stepped back behind the sleek acrylic podium and tapped the microphone twice. The sharp, clear sound echoed instantly through the state-of-the-art audio system. The soft, sophisticated jazz music playing in the background immediately cut out. The low hum of networking conversations across the vast ballroom died down completely as every single face in the crowd turned back toward me. The spotlight swung over, catching the midnight blue silk of my custom gown. I gripped the edges of the podium and looked directly down at my father. The smug, confident smile on his face began to waver as he realized I was not holding the microphone to validate his claims. I was holding it to execute him. I let a profound, heavy silence stretch across the room, ensuring that every person present was hanging on my next words. I made eye contact with the specific group of billionaire investors Richard had just attempted to manipulate. Then I looked back down at the man who had ordered me to pay a $3,699 restaurant bill just a few days prior. "I am afraid there has been a significant misunderstanding," I announced, my voice ringing with an icy, absolute authority that left no room for debate. "The man who just spoke does not represent Monarch Hospitality Group. He had absolutely nothing to do with the founding, funding, or strategic vision of this corporate empire. In fact, I have not spoken to him in 5 years." A collective shocked gasp rippled through the front rows of the audience. The high society elite thrived on exclusivity and propriety. Publicly disavowing someone at a grand opening was a drastic, unprecedented move. Richard's face drained of all color. He took a staggering step backward, bumping into my mother, Patricia, who looked as though the floor had suddenly dropped out from beneath her. Cameron stood completely frozen, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. I leaned slightly closer to the microphone, ensuring my next words would be permanently etched into the memory of every powerful business leader in the room. "Oh, we are not family," I stated smoothly, my tone completely deadpan and devoid of any emotional warmth. "In fact, my security team is waiting to hand you these." On my precise vocal cue, the heavy oak doors at the side of the grand ballroom swung open. 2 massive elite security guards dressed in immaculate tailored black suits stepped out from the shadows. They moved with absolute terrifying synchronization. They were not standard event bouncers. They were highly trained private corporate security professionals who answered exclusively to me. They marched directly across the polished black marble floor, their heavy footsteps cutting through the absolute dead silence of the stunned crowd. The sea of wealthy investors instinctively parted, forming a wide, clear path for the guards. Each guard carried a polished, gleaming silver platter. The presentation was deliberately theatrical and profoundly devastating. Resting squarely in the center of each silver platter was a thick, heavy manila envelope. The guards reached the front row and stopped precisely in front of my father and my brother. They stood like immovable statues, flanking Richard and Cameron, completely boxing them in. The physical intimidation was palpable. The message was unmistakable. They were entirely trapped inside a fortress I controlled. "Sir, please take the envelope," the lead security guard commanded, his voice low, but carrying enough volume to be heard by the surrounding crowd. Richard's hands were trembling so violently he could barely raise his arms. He looked around the room, his eyes darting frantically toward the elite investors he had just tried to court. Those same investors were now taking deliberate steps backward, actively distancing themselves from the toxic spectacle. Nobody wanted to be standing near a man currently being cornered by elite corporate security. Patricia let out a high-pitched, terrified whimper, covering her mouth with both hands. Cameron's breathing became shallow and rapid. His eyes were wide with blind panic. He stared at the silver platter presented to him as if it held a live explosive device. "Take the envelope, sir." The second security guard repeated his tone, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or refusal. Cameron reached out with a shaking, sweaty hand and grabbed the thick manila envelope off the silver platter. Richard did the same, his movements stiff and jerky. They had marched into my building expecting to be handed blank checks and lucrative partnership agreements. They believed their sheer audacity would somehow bully me into submission. They truly thought these envelopes contained a polite cease and desist order, or perhaps a hush-money settlement to make them quietly go away. "Open it," I commanded from the podium, my voice echoing through the silent, cavernous room. I wanted everyone to witness the exact moment their fraudulent house of cards completely collapsed. Cameron ripped open the top of the envelope, tearing the heavy paper in his frantic haste. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on crisp white paper. The bold black lettering at the top of the first page was clearly visible to the people standing immediately next to them. It was not a civil lawsuit. It was not a simple corporate warning. It was a formal federal document bearing the unmistakable seal of the United States government. Cameron's eyes scanned the first few lines of the document. The remaining color vanished from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to grab his father's shoulder just to keep himself standing upright. The papers in his hands began to shake violently. "What is it?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking with intense fear. He pulled his own documents from the envelope and stared at the pages. "They are federal subpoenas," I announced from the podium, ensuring the entire ballroom of powerful stakeholders understood exactly what kind of criminals had attempted to infiltrate their exclusive network. "They are formal federal subpoenas for identity theft, wire fraud, and grand larceny. They detail the exact unauthorized use of my personal Social Security number to secure a fraudulent $500,000 commercial loan. They also contain the forensic financial tracking of those stolen funds directly into hidden offshore accounts." A loud collective gasp erupted from the crowd of elite investors. The whispers began instantly spreading like wildfire across the grand ballroom. High society thrived on prestige, but it absolutely despised financial fraud. The wealthy moguls and venture capitalists, who had been politely listening to Cameron's desperate pitches just minutes ago, now looked at him with profound, pure disgust. They realized they had been targeted by a broke, desperate con artist. My mother, Patricia, let out a loud, dramatic wail. She grabbed my father's arm, trying to pull him away from the intense, glaring spotlight of public judgment. Richard just stood there, completely paralyzed, clutching the federal subpoena that effectively ended his life as a free man. The fake millionaire facade had been entirely violently stripped away. They were completely exposed, naked and vulnerable, in front of the very people they had dedicated their entire pathetic lives trying to impress. "Please escort these gentlemen and their guest off my property," I instructed the security guards, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any sympathy. "They are no longer welcome at Aura or any other establishment owned by the Monarch Hospitality Group. Hand them directly over to the federal authorities currently waiting in the front lobby." The two massive security guards stepped forward and firmly grabbed Richard and Cameron by their upper arms. There was no gentle guidance. It was a forceful physical removal. Cameron dropped his half-empty glass of expensive champagne. It shattered violently against the pristine black marble floor, sending shards of crystal and spilled wine flying in every direction. It was a perfect physical representation of his ruined, fraudulent life. "Do not touch me!" Richard screamed weakly, attempting to wrestle his arm away from the guard's iron grip. "You cannot do this. We are your family. We raised you." The guards ignored his pathetic protests. They spun him around and began marching him toward the exit. Cameron did not even try to fight back. He looked completely catatonic, his eyes glazed over with the absolute certainty of his impending prison sentence. Patricia scrambled frantically behind them, sobbing loudly and trying to hide her face from the countless cell phone cameras that were now actively recording their humiliating exit. The sea of powerful billionaires parted once again, allowing the disgraced family to be marched through the center of the grand ballroom. The silence was broken only by Patricia's loud weeping and the heavy, synchronized footsteps of the security detail. I stood at the acrylic podium watching them take the long, agonizing walk of absolute shame. They were dragged past the exquisite ice sculptures, the premium champagne bars, and the elite guests they had tried so desperately to manipulate. The heavy glass doors at the entrance of the ballroom swung open. Through the gap, I could see the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles already waiting in the main reception lobby outside. My legal team had executed the trap, flawlessly coordinating the subpoena delivery with the exact arrival time of the federal task force. The doors swung shut behind my family, cutting off Patricia's final theatrical sob and sealing them out of my world forever. I smoothed the front of my midnight blue silk gown and leaned back into the microphone. The crowd turned their attention back to me, their faces a mixture of absolute awe and profound respect. I had not just removed a threat. I had demonstrated an untouchable, ruthless power that every single business leader in that room deeply understood and admired. I apologize for that brief, unfortunate interruption, I said, a warm, genuine smile returning to my face. As I was saying, Monarch Hospitality Group is committed to maintaining the absolute highest standards of integrity and excellence. Please continue to enjoy the magnificent evening we have prepared for you tonight. The orchestral jazz music immediately swelled back to life, filling the vast, beautiful space with sophisticated energy. The waiters seamlessly resumed circulating with fresh trays of premium champagne. The party roared back to life, completely undisturbed by the removal of the toxic garbage. I stepped down from the podium and walked smoothly into the crowd. My family had thought they could crash my greatest triumph and steal my crown. Instead, they had provided the perfect entertainment for my victory lap. But as I accepted a fresh glass of champagne and smiled at my investors, I knew the war was not entirely over. A cornered rat will always try to bite back, and Cameron was about to make one final, desperate, catastrophic mistake. The devastating footage of my father and brother being physically escorted out of Aura in federal handcuffs did not just stay within the confined elite circles of the grand ballroom. High society thrives on gossip, but it absolutely weaponizes public humiliation. By Sunday morning, secretly recorded cell phone videos of their disastrous exit were circulating wildly across local business forums and exclusive corporate group chats. By Monday morning, the local financial press had picked up the story, completely annihilating Cameron's fake venture capital empire. The immediate public fallout was absolutely catastrophic for them. The few mid-level investors who had been blindly entertaining Cameron's desperate pitches immediately severed all contact. The bank holding the fraudulent $500,000 commercial loan officially initiated the aggressive default protocol. My father country club suspended his membership pending the results of the federal investigation. They were suddenly total social and financial pariahs trapped in a massive public nightmare of their own making. I arrived at my corporate headquarters on Tuesday morning feeling a deep, profound sense of absolute closure. I had executed my defensive strategy flawlessly, protecting my identity and my corporate assets, while simultaneously holding my toxic family completely accountable for their massive federal crimes. I assumed the battle was officially over. I assumed they would quietly retreat into the shadows to prepare for their impending criminal trials. I underestimated the sheer dangerous delusion of a truly desperate, cornered narcissist. My executive assistant Megan walked into my office holding a thick, printed document. Her expression was deeply troubled, a stark contrast to her usual unflappable professional demeanor. "We just received an encrypted email sent directly to your private corporate inbox," she said, placing the document carefully onto my glass desk. "The encryption protocols bypassed our standard spam filters. It is from an anonymous sender, but the content makes the source entirely obvious." I picked up the printed email and began reading. The message was incredibly long, wildly aggressive, and completely unhinged. It was written with the desperate, frantic energy of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. It was from Cameron. "You think you are so smart, Vanessa," the email began, the text practically radiating absolute toxic hatred. "You think you can just destroy your own family and walk away laughing in your expensive silk dress? You think your precious elite investors are going to protect you when they find out who you really are. You are nothing but a massive fraud. I know exactly how you funded your little restaurant empire, and I have the hard, indisputable proof to completely destroy you. I felt a cold, sharp prickle of unease run down my spine. The accusation was completely fabricated. I had funded my very first small restaurant using a risky, high-interest small business loan and years of grueling, exhausting culinary work. I had the meticulous financial records to prove every single legitimate cent I had ever earned. But Cameron was not relying on facts. He was relying on the devastating power of a highly sensational public relations nightmare. The email continued detailing a massive, horrific lie. Cameron claimed that I had secretly manipulated our late grandfather into signing over his entire multi-million-dollar estate to me mere days before he died. He claimed I had stolen the generational wealth that rightfully belonged to the entire family and used it to secretly fund my hospitality group. He explicitly stated that he possessed forged medical documents and altered banking ledgers that would perfectly substantiate his completely fabricated claims. It was a blatant, massive lie, but it was a meticulously calculated and incredibly dangerous one. In the high-stakes world of luxury hospitality and elite corporate investment, public perception was absolute reality. If Cameron went to the national financial press with these fabricated documents, accusing the CEO of Monarch Hospitality Group of elder abuse and massive financial theft, it would trigger an immediate catastrophic crisis of confidence among my board of investors. Even if I eventually proved the documents were completely fake, the initial negative media explosion could permanently severely damage my brand and derail my massive upcoming international acquisitions. Cameron was fully, acutely aware of this extreme vulnerability. He was actively attempting to hold my entire corporate empire completely hostage. He ended the long, frantic email with a devastating, highly specific ultimatum. You have exactly 48 hours to officially drop all the federal fraud charges against me and Dad. You are going to publicly state that the loan was a simple corporate misunderstanding, and you are going to wire $1 million in clean, untraceable cash to a secure offshore account. If you do not meet every single one of these demands by Thursday morning, I am sending this entire file to the national financial press. I will make sure you lose absolutely everything, Vanessa. I slowly set the printed email back down onto my desk. The sheer magnitude of his absolute depravity was staggering. My brother was currently facing severe federal prison time for committing massive wire fraud, and his immediate response was to pivot directly to aggressive federal extortion. He was doubling down on his criminal behavior driven by a profound toxic delusion that he could still somehow bully me into total submission. "Get Marcus in here immediately," I instructed Megan, my voice tight with barely suppressed absolute fury. "Tell him to drop whatever he is doing. We have a massive aggressive extortion attempt to handle." Marcus arrived less than 10 minutes later, taking a seat across from me and quickly reading through the printed email. He let out a low, sharp whistle, running a hand through his hair. "This is incredibly dangerous, Vanessa," he said, his professional tone completely serious. "Extortion is a severe federal offense, but he is banking on the fact that you have far too much to lose to actually call his bluff. He knows a public scandal of this magnitude could severely cripple your current corporate acquisitions." "We are not negotiating with him, Marcus," I stated firmly, leaning forward and locking eyes with my attorney. "We are not dropping the original federal fraud charges, and I am absolutely not paying him a single cent of extortion money. I want to know exactly how we neutralize this immediate threat without triggering a massive catastrophic media circus." Marcus tapped his pen against the glass table, deep in intense strategic thought. "The core issue here is the fabricated evidence," he explained carefully. "If he has actually gone through the trouble of creating highly convincing fake medical documents and altered banking ledgers, the press will run with the story before we have time to authenticate them. Scandal sells faster than the truth. We need to find the physical source of those fake documents and completely destroy their credibility before he can release them." "How do we do that?" I asked, my frustration mounting rapidly. "We have less than 48 hours before his strict deadline expires. We deploy Cole again, Marcus replied, referencing our elite private investigator. We need him to immediately tap into Cameron Digital Communications. If Cameron is actively fabricating documents, he is either doing it himself or he has hired a shady third party to handle the forgeries. We need to find the digital trail and secure the actual raw proof that this is a completely manufactured extortion scheme. I nodded, giving Marcus absolute total authorization to proceed. Do whatever it takes. I want this threat completely permanently neutralized. The next 24 hours were an agonizing exercise in extreme patience and rigid self-control. I continued to run my massive hospitality group, projecting an image of absolute unflappable calm, while internally waiting for Cole to crack my brother digital fortress. Cameron sent 2 more encrypted emails during this tense waiting period, each one more aggressive and unhinged than the last. He demanded immediate confirmation that I was arranging the $1 million wire transfer. He threatened to release a small teaser of the fake documents to a local gossip blog just to prove he was incredibly serious. I maintained absolute strict radio silence, refusing to give him a single drop of the fearful reaction he so desperately craved. My refusal to engage clearly infuriated him, driving him deeper into a state of aggressive toxic panic. On Wednesday evening, exactly 12 hours before Cameron's strict extortion deadline was set to expire, Cole walked into my executive office. He looked completely exhausted, but there was a sharp, triumphant gleam in his dark eyes. He dropped a slim black encrypted hard drive directly onto my glass desk. I found the source, Cole announced, his voice rough with fatigue. He did not hire a professional forger, Vanessa. He is far too broke to afford one. He has been spending the last 3 days holed up in a cheap motel, using a basic commercial software program to clumsily alter existing family financial records. Cole tapped the black hard drive. I managed to gain secure remote access to his laptop. I mirrored his entire hard drive. We possess the raw digital files showing exactly how he manipulated the documents. We have the metadata proving these files were created this week, not 5 years ago. His extortion scheme is completely scientifically provable as an absolute total fraud. Relief washed over me, quickly followed by a cold, hard wave of absolute determination. The threat was effectively neutralized. We had the definitive proof needed to completely destroy his fabricated narrative if he attempted to go to the press. But simply blocking his attack was no longer enough. Cameron had crossed the final ultimate line. He had attempted to hold my entire life work completely hostage. Draft the final response. Marcus, I instructed my attorney, who was standing next to Cole. Tell him we refuse his demands entirely. Tell him we possess the mirrored hard drive proving his extortion scheme. And tell him that if he contacts me or my company ever again, I will hand this new evidence directly over to the federal prosecutor currently handling his active wire fraud case. Marcus nodded, a sharp, predatory smile matching my own. I will send the communication immediately, Vanessa. We have officially cornered him. I looked out the window at the darkening city skyline, feeling a profound sense of absolute finality. Cameron had played his last desperate card, and he had lost spectacularly. He was completely out of options, out of money, and rapidly running out of time before his federal trial began. I assumed the battle was finally truly over. I assumed he would collapse under the crushing weight of his own massive failures. But I completely underestimated the toxic loyalty of my mother, Patricia, and the extreme drastic lengths she would go to in order to protect her golden child from the devastating consequences of his own actions. The 48-hour deadline arrived and passed in absolute silence. I did not wire the extortion money. I did not contact the federal prosecutor to drop the wire fraud charges. I sat in my office and waited for my brother to make his move. However, the aggressive retaliation did not ultimately come from Cameron. The devastating public attack came directly from my mother. Patricia realized that Cameron was completely paralyzed by fear and lack of resources, so she took matters into her own hands, utilizing the only weapon she had left. She weaponized her own tears. On Thursday morning, my mother secured a highly coveted prime-time slot on the most watched local morning news program in the city. I sat in my corporate war room with my attorney Marcus and my public relations director, watching the live broadcast on the massive flat-screen television mounted to the wall. Patricia had orchestrated her appearance with sickening absolute perfection. She was not wearing the flashy designer clothes or heavy diamond jewelry she normally flaunted. Instead, she wore a simple, modest beige cardigan and minimal makeup. Her hair was styled to look slightly unkempt, giving the distinct illusion of a woman who had been awake for days, consumed by terrible maternal grief. The news anchor, a woman known for her sensationalist emotional reporting, leaned forward with deep, manufactured sympathy. Patricia looked directly into the camera lens and delivered the performance of a lifetime. "My daughter Vanessa has completely lost her way." Patricia wept, dabbing her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. "We loved her so much. We supported her when she was struggling, but the pursuit of corporate wealth has turned her into a monster. She is a ruthless, greedy shark who values money over her own flesh and blood." The anchor asked her to explain the federal charges currently pending against my brother. Patricia did not hesitate to spin a massive, horrific lie. "Cameron is completely innocent," she sobbed, gripping the edges of the tissue tightly. "He made a simple administrative clerical error on a business loan document. It was a minor mistake by a young, hardworking entrepreneur just trying to support his family. But Vanessa saw an opportunity to destroy him. She completely weaponized her corporate lawyers to twist this tiny clerical error into a federal crime just to punish us. But the absolute worst part of the interview was her explanation of my financial success. Patricia stared into the camera and unleashed the fabricated story Cameron had threatened me with. "Vanessa did not build that hospitality empire on her own," Patricia claimed, her voice trembling with righteous indignation. "When my elderly father was on his deathbed, highly vulnerable and confused, Vanessa secretly manipulated him. She stole his entire multi-million-dollar estate. She drained the generational wealth that rightfully belonged to this entire family and used it to secretly fund her luxury restaurants. She stole from a dying man, and now she is trying to throw her innocent brother in a federal prison to cover her tracks." The broadcast ended with my mother burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably on live television. I pressed the mute button on the remote control, plunging the war room into a heavy, tense silence. My public relations director looked physically ill. Marcus aggressively rubbed his temples, processing the sheer magnitude of the legal defamation that had just occurred. It was a masterclass in toxic manipulation. Patricia had successfully painted herself as a heartbroken victim and transformed me into a cold, calculating corporate villain. The public backlash was swift and incredibly brutal. The local media aggressively latched onto the sensational story of the billionaire hospitality CEO who stole from her dying grandfather and jailed her own brother. The news clip went instantly viral, spreading rapidly from local television to regional news networks and national social media platforms. The public loves a dramatic downfall, and they were more than eager to blindly accept my mother-fabricated narrative without a single shred of actual evidence. Within hours, a coordinated digital assault began. Thousands of negative one-star reviews flooded the online pages of my luxury restaurants and resorts. People who had never stepped foot inside my properties were leaving scathing comments, calling my food toxic, my business practices evil, and my personal character repulsive. My social media accounts were bombarded with death threats and hateful messages demanding I release my innocent brother and return the stolen money to my grieving mother. The digital harassment rapidly escalated into a physical threat. By Friday afternoon, dozens of angry protesters organized through my mother local community groups gathered outside the main entrance of the Monarch. They held up crude cardboard signs accusing me of elder abuse and corporate greed. They shouted aggressively at legitimate patrons trying to enter the restaurant, forcing my elite security team to form a solid physical barricade just to keep the front doors clear. The pristine, flawless reputation of the Monarch Hospitality Group was actively bleeding out in the streets. The escalating public relations nightmare caused an immediate severe panic among my corporate board of investors. At 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon, I was forced to call an emergency board meeting. The atmosphere inside the main executive conference room was incredibly tense. 7 wealthy, highly influential investors sat around the massive polished table, their faces grim and sweating with anxiety. These were men and women who dealt in billions of dollars, but they were terrified of bad publicity. Vanessa, the optics on this situation are absolutely disastrous. The lead investor, a man named Richard Sterling, stated firmly, tossing a printed copy of a negative news article onto the table. We are less than 2 weeks away from finalizing the aggressive acquisition of 3 major international properties in London and Tokyo. Those foreign stakeholders are incredibly conservative. They do not want to associate their historic brands with a CEO currently embroiled in a messy, highly publicized family fraud scandal. Another investor chimed in, her tone sharp and demanding. The protesters outside your flagship restaurant are scaring away our high net worth clientele. We are actively losing revenue. You need to make this completely disappear immediately. We strongly advise you to quietly settle with your family. Pay your brother the $1 million he is demanding. Have your legal team drop the federal fraud charges and force your mother to sign a strict non-disclosure agreement. It is simply the cost of doing business, Vanessa. Pay the extortion money and make the bad press go away today. I stood at the head of the conference table looking at the panicked faces of the board members. They wanted me to surrender. They wanted me to bow down to my toxic family and hand over $1 million just to protect the quarterly profit margins. They expected me to cave under the immense pressure of public opinion. I am not paying a single cent of extortion money, I announced, my voice echoing with a cold, hard authority that commanded the room. And I am absolutely not dropping the federal charges against my brother. The board erupted in immediate protests, but I slammed my hand flat against the table, instantly silencing them. If you pay an extortionist once you guarantee they will return, I explained, my gaze sweeping across the room. If I pay Cameron $1 million today, he will be back next year demanding $5 million. He will hold this fabricated story over my head for the rest of my natural life. I refuse to compromise my personal integrity or the operational security of this corporate empire to appease a desperate criminal. I pulled up the preliminary findings from my private investigator on the main projector screen. I do not negotiate with terrorists, and I do not surrender to toxic manipulation, I stated firmly. I have the raw digital evidence proving my brother fabricated those documents. I have the banking records proving my initial startup capital was entirely legitimate. I am asking this board to hold the line and trust my leadership. The bad press is temporary. I am about to end this war permanently. Give me 24 hours to execute my final strategy. The sheer force of my absolute confidence temporarily placated the board. They reluctantly agreed to give me the weekend to neutralize the threat before they formally intervened. The meeting adjourned, leaving me entirely alone in the massive executive suite. It was past midnight. The vast corporate building was completely empty, silent, and dark, save for the emergency lights and the glowing screens of my computer monitors. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. The bright neon lights reflected off the glass, mirroring the intense exhaustion weighing heavily on my shoulders. Fighting a ruthless corporate war was exhausting, but fighting a war against the people who share your blood requires a fundamentally different kind of terrible endurance. I was meticulously reviewing the latest security protocols for the international acquisitions when a soft, distinct sound broke the absolute silence of the room. It was the quiet, melodic chime of the private executive elevator. My entire body instantly tensed. That specific elevator bypassed the main lobby entirely. It required a highly restricted biometric keycard to operate. Only 3 people in the entire city possessed access to that private elevator. Me, my lead attorney Marcus, and the heavily armed head of my corporate security detail. Neither Marcus nor my security chief had notified me they were coming upstairs. I slowly reached into the top drawer of my glass desk and rested my hand firmly against the cold, heavy metal of the emergency panic button. I kept my eyes locked onto the polished steel doors of the elevator, waiting in the dim, ambient light of the penthouse office. The heavy steel doors slid open with a smooth mechanical hiss. I braced myself, expecting to see a security breach. Instead, the doors opened to reveal a deeply unexpected and completely shocking visitor. It was Courtney. My brother Cameron's snooty, incredibly entitled wife. She stepped out of the elevator cab and into the reception area. She looked absolutely terrified. Her usually immaculate blonde hair was messy and unkempt. She was wearing a heavy dark trench coat pulled tightly around her body, and she was clutching her expensive designer handbag against her chest like a physical shield. She was physically trembling, shaking so badly her expensive heels clicked erratically against the marble floor. Courtney looked past the reception desk and made direct eye contact with me standing inside my office. She did not say a word. She simply reached into her designer handbag with a trembling hand and pulled out a small, sleek silver object. It was a highly encrypted, secure digital flash drive. She held it out toward me, her eyes wide with sheer desperate panic, holding the very key to my brother. Absolute destruction in the palm of her shaking hand. I remained perfectly still, keeping my hand resting casually near the concealed panic button beneath my desk. Courtney took a hesitant step into my office. The heavy glass doors of the private elevator slid shut behind her, cutting off her only immediate exit. She flinched at the sound, jumping slightly before turning her wide, terrified eyes back to me. This was a woman I had only ever known to be impeccably arrogant. For the past 5 years, Courtney had gleefully participated in my family toxic dynamic. She had eagerly worn the designer dresses bought with stolen money and actively looked down on me whenever my name was brought up. Now she looked like a completely shattered porcelain doll. "How did you bypass my building security?" I asked, my voice hard and commanding. I did not offer her a seat. I did not ask her if she wanted a glass of water. This was not a social visit. Courtney swallowed hard, clutching the small silver flash drive so tightly her knuckles were stark white. "I stole Cameron's backup biometric keycard." She confessed, her voice trembling so violently I could barely hear her over the quiet hum of the air conditioning. "He cloned it from one of your senior executives during a networking event months ago. He kept it hidden in his home office safe. I broke into the safe tonight." She slowly walked across the expansive room, her expensive heels clicking erratically on the imported rug. She stopped exactly 3 feet away from the edge of my glass desk. She did not attempt to engage in any superficial pleasantries. She did not offer a fake apology for the years of horrific abuse she had happily enabled. She simply reached out with a shaking hand and placed the small encrypted silver flash drive directly onto the center of my desk. The metal clinked sharply against the glass. I looked down at the drive and then back up at her tear-stained face. "What is this?" I demanded, keeping my expression completely unreadable. "It is your absolute salvation," Courtney replied, her voice cracking under the immense weight of her own panic. "And it is my only leverage." She wrapped her arms tightly around her trench coat, shivering, as if the temperature in the room had suddenly dropped below freezing. "Cameron is completely out of control, Vanessa. His narcissism has entirely fractured our marriage. I thought he was just arrogant and ambitious, but he is completely delusional. He truly believed he could extort $1 million from you and walk away unscathed. But when you refused to pay the extortion money, and my mother-in-law went on television today, he realized his entire scheme was collapsing. The federal authorities have been circling his fake firm all week. The bank is actively foreclosing on our home." Courtney took a ragged, desperate breath. "He is planning to flee the country, Vanessa. He has a private charter flight booked for tomorrow night out of a small regional airport. He is planning to take the remaining stolen loan money and run to a non-extradition country. And he is planning to leave me completely behind to take the fall for his massive debts. He does not care about me. He does not care about your parents. He does not care about anyone but himself." The sheer magnitude of Cameron's cowardly betrayal washed over me. He had orchestrated a massive federal wire fraud scheme, allowed our mother to go on live television to ruin my reputation, and now he was planning to abandon his own wife and parents to face the catastrophic legal consequences of his actions alone. It was the ultimate, profound manifestation of the toxic golden child syndrome. He believed he was completely above the law and entirely immune to consequences. I sat back in my plush leather chair, analyzing the terrified woman standing before me. "Why come to me, Courtney? If you know he is fleeing, why not go straight to the federal authorities and secure immunity for yourself?" "Because the authorities will freeze all the assets instantly." Courtney sobbed hot tears, finally spilling over her mascara-stained cheeks. They will seize my bank accounts, my car, my jewelry, everything. I will be left completely destitute, facing potential accessory charges, just for being married to him. I cannot go to the police, Vanessa. I need protection. I need an ironclad exit strategy that keeps me out of a federal prison cell. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at the small silver flash drive resting on my desk. That drive contains everything you need to completely annihilate him. I downloaded the entire contents of his private encrypted server before I left the house tonight. It has the exact routing numbers for all his hidden offshore accounts. It has the raw IP addresses and the digital timestamps proving unequivocally that he was the one who forged your signature on that commercial loan document. I stared at the silver drive. It was the absolute holy grail of physical evidence. My private investigator had already uncovered the digital trail, but possessing Cameron's own local backup server meant having the raw, unfiltered data. It would instantly bypass months of tedious legal discovery and allow me to execute a flawless, instantaneous checkmate. But Courtney was not finished speaking. It also has his fake financial records, Courtney continued, wiping her face with the back of her trembling hand. It contains the raw, unedited files showing exactly how he fabricated the documents he used to try and extort you. It proves that the story about you stealing from your grandfather's estate is a complete and total fabrication. He created those fake ledgers on his laptop 3 days ago. My heart hammered a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. Cameron had handed me the very weapon he intended to use to destroy me. By abandoning his wife, he had created the ultimate defector. Courtney had happily lived in the lavish bubble of his fraudulent wealth, but her loyalty evaporated the exact second she realized she was going to be left holding the bag for his federal crimes. She was entirely driven by pure, unadulterated self-preservation. I did not reach for the flash drive immediately. I needed to establish total absolute dominance over the situation. I needed her to understand that she was not negotiating from a position of equal power. She was surrendering to a vastly superior force. You actively participated in the smear campaign against me, Courtney? I stated, my voice dropping to a dangerous, chilling register. You sat at the Monarch and laughed when they tried to force me to pay a $4,000 bill. You wore designer clothes bought with money stolen using my identity. Do not stand in my office and pretend you are an innocent victim. You are only here because the ship is sinking and you are desperately looking for a lifeboat. Courtney flinched violently, shrinking back from the raw intensity of my words. I know, she whispered, hanging her head in shame. I know I was awful to you. I was arrogant and greedy and blind. I let them poison my mind because it was easier than facing the reality of my failing marriage. I am not asking for your forgiveness, Vanessa. I am not asking for your friendship. I am asking for a simple transactional business deal. She stepped closer to the desk, her eyes burning with a fierce, desperate intensity. She reached out and tapped her index finger directly on top of the encrypted silver flash drive. This drive has all his offshore accounts, the IP addresses, proving he forged your signature and his fake financial records. She looked me directly in the eyes, delivering her final, desperate ultimatum. What is it worth to you? The silence in the executive office stretched out tight and heavy with anticipation. Courtney was standing on the edge of a massive cliff, offering me a parachute in exchange for a safety net. She wanted me to fund her escape. She wanted top-tier legal representation to protect her from the federal fallout that would inevitably occur when I dropped this absolute bombshell on my family. I looked down at the flash drive and then back up at the broken, terrified woman. The bad public relations campaign orchestrated by my mother was actively damaging my hospitality empire. My board of investors was pressuring me to settle. My brother was preparing to vanish into the night with stolen money, leaving a trail of absolute destruction in his wake. This flash drive was the precise surgical instrument I needed to excise the cancer from my life permanently. I reached out slowly and placed my hand firmly over the silver drive, claiming absolute ownership of the devastating evidence. I did not smile. I did not offer her any warmth or false comfort. It is worth your absolute freedom, Courtney, I replied, my voice ringing with undeniable cold authority. But you are going to earn it. You are going to sit down right now and give my attorneys a full sworn, legally binding recorded statement detailing every single crime your husband has committed. You are going to hand over every password, every hidden account number, and every single piece of dirty laundry this family has been hiding for the past 5 years. If you hold back a single detail, I will hand you and this drive directly to the FBI. Courtney let out a sharp, ragged gasp of pure relief and nodded frantically. I will tell them everything, she promised, her voice breaking. I will give you whatever you want. Just please protect me from him. I picked up my office phone and pressed the speed dial button for Marcus. My lead attorney answered immediately. Marcus, I said, my eyes never leaving Courtney's face. Get the legal team into the main conference room right now. Cancel everything else on your schedule. We have a highly cooperative witness ready to give a full sworn deposition, and we possess the raw physical evidence proving the extortion and the wire fraud. I hung up the phone and slipped the silver flash drive into my pocket. The war was no longer a defensive maneuver. I had the ammunition required to launch a total devastating offensive. My brother thought he could orchestrate a massive fraud, extort a billionaire CEO, and simply fly away into the sunset. He thought he could abandon his wife and leave me to deal with the terrifying media circus his mother had created. He was about to discover that running from the law was entirely possible, but running from my vengeance was an absolute impossibility. I was going to lock down his escape routes, freeze his stolen assets, and drag him back to the very city he was trying to abandon. I was going to use this flash drive to orchestrate a final catastrophic meeting that would systematically break down every single lie my family had ever told. The board of investors wanted me to quietly pay $1 million to make the problem disappear. I was going to do something much more satisfying. I was going to make my toxic family publicly beg for mercy before I completely and permanently destroyed them. I kept my word to Courtney with swift and ruthless efficiency. Within 24 hours, my legal team drafted an ironclad immunity agreement and secured her the most vicious, high-profile divorce attorney in the entire state. We paid the massive retainer in full, transferring the funds quietly and securely. Courtney provided a comprehensive sworn deposition that left absolutely no room for ambiguity. She detailed Cameron's escape plan, verified the contents of the encrypted flash drive, and officially went into hiding at a secure private location funded entirely by my corporate accounts. My brother had planned to leave his wife to the wolves, but he had unknowingly handed me the very weapon I needed to permanently end his miserable existence. With the physical evidence secured, Marcus and I immediately moved to the next phase of the operation. We contacted the federal authorities completely anonymously, leveraging Cole's extensive network of former law enforcement contacts to freeze Cameron's passport and flag his private charter flight. He was grounded. He could not leave the city, let alone the country. But he did not know that yet. We allowed him to believe his escape plan was still perfectly viable. We allowed him to believe he still held the absolute upper hand. I instructed Marcus to contact my family and formally request an emergency mediation meeting. We deliberately chose a neutral location, selecting a prestigious but unaffordable law firm in the financial district. We needed to project the exact illusion of a major corporation scrambling to mitigate a devastating public relations disaster. We needed them to believe that Patricia's unhinged television interview had successfully panicked my board of investors and forced me to the negotiating table. The bait was set perfectly. The mediation was scheduled for Friday morning, exactly 48 hours after Patricia's tearful television broadcast. I sat at the far end of the expansive mahogany conference table, my hands folded neatly in front of me. Marcus sat to my right, an open legal pad resting on the polished wood. The room was bathed in cold, natural light filtering through the massive windows. The atmosphere was completely sterile, devoid of any personal touches or emotional warmth. It was the perfect stage for a corporate execution. My family was intentionally kept waiting in the lobby for exactly 15 minutes. It was a standard power play designed to heighten their anticipation and inflate their already massive egos. When the heavy glass doors to the conference room finally swung open, they marched inside with an air of absolute, undeniable triumph. They did not look like people facing imminent federal prison sentences. They looked like conquering royalty arriving to collect their hard-earned tribute. My mother, Patricia, walked in first. The modest beige cardigan and tear-stained face from her television interview were completely gone. She was back in her expensive designer clothing, wearing heavy diamond jewelry she had likely purchased on credit. She carried her designer handbag like a trophy, her chin tilted upward in an expression of supreme, arrogant validation. She looked at me with a smirk that communicated absolute victory. She truly believed she had publicly destroyed my reputation and forced me to crawl back to them begging for mercy. My father, Richard, followed closely behind her. He strode into the room with his chest puffed out, pulling out the heavy leather chair opposite me and sitting down with aggressive authority. He did not wait to be invited. He simply claimed the space. He looked around the pristine law office, nodding approvingly, as if he were inspecting a property he was about to purchase. Cameron was the last to enter. I watched him carefully analyzing his physical demeanor. Beneath the expensive rented suit and the arrogant smirk, I could see the profound physical toll of his underlying panic. There were dark, heavy circles under his eyes. His hands twitched slightly as he pulled out his chair. He knew his federal trial was looming. He knew his secret charter flight was scheduled for that very evening. He was attempting to execute one final massive extortion scheme before vanishing into the night. He believed he was about to secure a $1 million payday to fund his cowardly escape. They sat across from me, presenting a united toxic front. They were completely convinced that my request for mediation meant I had surrendered. They thought my board of investors had broken my resolve. They expected to see a desperate, terrified CEO willing to sign whatever they demanded just to make the public nightmare disappear. Well, Vanessa, my father began, his voice dripping with condescension and false authority. I am glad to see you finally came to your senses. Your mother television appearance was unfortunate but necessary. You left us with absolutely no other choice. We tried to handle this family matter privately, but your stubborn refusal to cooperate forced our hand. Patricia let out a soft, dramatic sigh, adjusting her diamond bracelet. We do not want to see your little restaurant business fail, Vanessa. We really do not. But you have behaved incredibly poorly. You showed zero respect for your family. This entire public scandal could have been completely avoided if you had just been reasonable and helped your brother when he needed you. I maintained a perfectly blank expression. I did not react to the staggering gaslighting. I did not point out that they had committed massive wire fraud, stolen my identity, and attempted to extort me for $50,000 before Patricia ever stepped in front of a news camera. I let them build their false narrative. I let them climb as high as possible before I kicked the ladder out from underneath them. Cameron leaned forward, resting his elbows aggressively on the conference table. He looked directly at me, his eyes narrowing with toxic greed. Let us skip the family drama and get straight to the business at hand, he demanded, his voice rough with manufactured confidence. Your public relations team is clearly in full-blown panic mode. Your board of investors wants this problem to go away today. We hold all the leverage here, Vanessa. You are going to give us exactly what we want, or Mom goes on the national networks tomorrow morning and completely destroys whatever is left of your brand. I kept my voice completely even, devoid of any emotion. What exactly are your demands, Cameron? State them for the record. Richard took over acting as the aggressive negotiator for their fraudulent enterprise. He pulled a piece of folded paper from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table. We have drafted a highly specific list of requirements, he stated, tapping the paper with his index finger. First, you will immediately contact the federal authorities and formally drop all criminal charges related to the commercial loan. You will provide a sworn statement that the entire situation was a simple corporate misunderstanding on your part. I nodded slowly, offering no verbal agreement but encouraging him to continue. Second, Richard continued, his voice rising with unearned, arrogant authority. You will immediately wire $500,000 directly to the bank to pay off the commercial loan in full. You will clear your brother business debt entirely today. You will also transfer an additional $1 million into a secure account designated by Cameron to compensate us for the severe emotional distress and public humiliation you caused us at the Monarch. Patricia smiled smugly, clearly anticipating a massive influx of unearned wealth to fund her high society lifestyle. And the final condition, Cameron chimed in, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. You are going to sign over a 20% equity stake in your entire hospitality group directly to me. I will be appointed as a senior executive partner. My venture capital firm will officially merge with your corporate brand. We will rebrand the company to feature the family name. You need my financial expertise to save your failing public image, Vanessa. This is a mutually beneficial business arrangement. The sheer profound audacity of his demands was almost difficult to physically process. They had committed identity theft, wire fraud, and grand larceny. They had publicly defamed me on local television. They had incited a mob of angry protesters to harass my legitimate businesses, and now they were sitting in a corporate law office demanding I pay their debts, give them $1 million in cash, and hand over a massive percentage of the multi-hundred-million-dollar empire I had built entirely with my own blood and sweat. They were demanding I surrender my life work to the very people who had ruthlessly abused me for 3 decades. They looked at me with hungry, expectant eyes, waiting for me to surrender. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached under the massive table and pressed a switch. The automated blinds descended, plunging the room into deep shadow. I quietly turned on the high-definition ceiling projector. The bright beam of the projector cut through the darkened conference room, casting a stark white rectangle against the far wall. The sudden shift in lighting caused my family to blink in confusion. They had expected me to hand over a signed contract or a multi-million-dollar check. Instead, they were staring at a crisp, high-definition display of a computer desktop. It was not my desktop. The customized background image featured a sleek black sports car parked outside a lavish mansion. It was Cameron's personal laptop screen. I picked up a small remote control from the table and pressed play. A crystal-clear screen recording began to run. The silence in the room was absolute as my family watched the digital cursor move across the projected image. The recording captured every single keystroke and mouse click in devastating real time. We watched as Cameron logged into a highly secure encrypted banking portal. We watched him enter his private credentials. We watched the screen load to display a staggering negative balance on his domestic commercial accounts. Then the recording shifted to a new tab. It was an international wire transfer portal. The video displayed Cameron actively routing hundreds of thousands of dollars from the fraudulent commercial loan directly into 3 distinct hidden offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands. The exact routing numbers, the account names, and the precise digital timestamps were magnified on the wall for everyone to see. There was absolutely no room for denial. It was raw, indisputable scientific proof of massive federal money laundering and wire fraud. I turned my gaze away from the projection screen and looked directly at my brother. The color had completely violently drained from Cameron's face. He looked as though he had just been injected with ice water. His jaw hung slack and his eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He knew that this level of access was only possible if someone had physically breached his heavily guarded home server. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his chest heaving with shallow, rapid breaths. "Your wife sends her absolute best regards, Cameron," I stated, my voice cutting through the dark room like a newly sharpened blade. Courtney decided that spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary as your willing accomplice did not quite align with her long-term lifestyle goals. She traded your entire digital life for top-tier legal immunity and a one-way ticket out of your disastrous marriage. She handed over every single encrypted file, every hidden asset, and your pathetic little flight itinerary. Your private charter plane was flagged and grounded by federal authorities 12 hours ago. You are not going anywhere. My mother, Patricia, let out a sharp, terrified gasp. She grabbed Richard's arm, her manicured nails digging deeply into his expensive suit jacket. Richard's face shifted from arrogant entitlement to a mask of sheer panic. He opened his mouth to formulate a desperate lie, but I raised my hand, silencing him. "I am not finished, Richard," I commanded, pressing the button on the remote control to advance the slide. "You wanted to play a public relations game. You allowed your wife to go on television and accuse me of stealing from a dying man. You tried to destroy my corporate empire by claiming I drained my grandfather's estate. You demanded extortion money to hide a crime I never committed. Now let us look at the truth. The projection screen shifted from Cameron laptop recording to a series of official banking ledgers. These documents bore the unmistakable watermarks of elite forensic accounting firms and the official seals of federal banking institutions. I had unleashed my private investigators to unearth the darkest buried secrets of our family financial history. These are the authenticated raw financial records of grandfather estate. I explained, highlighting a specific column of dates and massive withdrawals. The records show the exact flow of his generational wealth during the final agonizing months of his life. Notice the dates carefully. These liquid transfers occurred exactly 5 years ago. They happened right around the time you unceremoniously kicked me out and told me I was a worthless disappointment. They happened while I was sleeping on a terrible mattress. I clicked to the next slide, revealing the final destination of those massive stolen funds. You did not use that money to pay for medical care, I stated, my voice ringing with cold fury. You did not use it to preserve his legacy. You and Cameron systematically drained a dying man's entire life savings. The routing numbers clearly match your personal domestic accounts, Richard. You used his money to pay off the debts on your suburban mansion. You used it to buy luxury cars. You used his stolen wealth to fund Cameron fake venture capital startup. You committed the exact heinous crime you just publicly accused me of committing. You are the real thieves. My father looked at the giant projected screen as if it were a massive approaching executioner. The physical evidence was entirely overwhelming. His entire life was built on a foundation of profound hypocrisy and devastating theft. Patricia stared at the banking ledgers, her eyes darting back and forth between the dates and the transfer amounts. She looked at Richard with a sudden, horrifying realization. She had just gone on television and directed the entire media spotlight onto a crime her own husband and son had actually committed. She had basically painted a massive bright red target on their own backs. You walked into this mediation room believing you held all the leverage. I continued, pacing slowly across the dark carpeted floor. You truly believed your fabricated media circus broke my resolve. You expected me to hand over $1 million and surrender 20% of my hospitality group. You completely underestimated my absolute willingness to burn this entire toxic family dynamic to the ground. Cameron was visibly shaking now. His arrogant posture had totally collapsed, leaving him hunched over the mahogany table like a cornered, terrified animal. He reached up and loosened his tie, gasping for air in the sterile, quiet room. "We can fix this," Cameron pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "Vanessa, please, we can retract the statements. Mom will go back on television and say she made a mistake. We will figure out a way to pay the bank back. Just do not give these files to the authorities. They will lock me away for decades. Please, you are my sister." I stopped pacing and stood directly at the head of the long table, towering over them in the dim ambient light. "I am not your sister," I corrected him, my tone completely devoid of any familial warmth or sympathy. "I am the chief executive officer of the Monarch Hospitality Group, and you are a hostile criminal threat that I am currently neutralizing." My father tried to salvage whatever tiny fragment of power he thought he had left. "You cannot use those documents, Vanessa," Richard argued, his voice trembling with sheer desperation. "They were obtained illegally. Courtney stole them from Cameron's private server. They will never hold up in a court of law." I let out a chilling laugh that echoed off the blank walls. "Do you really think I care about the admissibility of evidence in a civil trial, Richard? I am not taking you to small claims court. I am handing a neatly wrapped package of definitive financial fraud to the federal government. By the time their forensic teams execute search warrants on your home and seize your physical hard drives, the origin of Courtney flash drive will not matter. The feds will find the exact same evidence. You are inescapably trapped." I reached into my designer briefcase and pulled out a single crisp piece of legal paper prepared by my lead attorney, Marcus. I walked slowly around the massive mahogany table, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I placed the document flat onto the surface directly in front of my trembling father. I placed an expensive silver fountain pen right next to it. The room was suffocatingly silent, broken only by Cameron's ragged, panicked breathing. "You have exactly 60 seconds," I announced, tapping my index finger deliberately against the pristine white paper. "You will sign a full public retraction of your vicious lies. You will sign full detailed confessions to the commercial bank regarding the massive loan fraud. You will legally waive any right to ever contact me, step foot in my luxury properties, or use my corporate name again. If you do not comply immediately, this highly encrypted flash drive goes directly to the aggressive FBI task force currently waiting for my signal in the downstairs lobby. The absolute final choice is entirely yours to make today, but the strict countdown has officially begun. You are completely out of time and out of options, so choose very wisely." Patricia sobbed loudly in the sterile quiet of the conference room. It was not the theatrical practiced weeping she had performed for the television cameras. This was a raw, ugly, visceral sound, pulled from the very depths of a woman who had finally been forced to confront the absolute ruin of her own making. The diamond bracelet on her wrist clattered against the mahogany table as she buried her face in her hands. She realized with devastating clarity that her carefully constructed world of high society luncheons, country club memberships, and perfectly curated appearances had just permanently vanished. The public retraction she was required to sign would instantly obliterate whatever tiny shred of credibility she had left in her elite circles. Her friends would turn their backs the moment they discovered the truth. She had traded her daughter for a golden child who turned out to be a broke federal criminal, and now she was entirely, utterly alone. Cameron snatched the expensive silver fountain pen from the table. His breathing was fast and shallow, the sound echoing loudly in the quiet room. He was hyperventilating, practically suffocating on the absolute certainty of his impending prison sentence. He grabbed the legal documents Marcus had prepared and began signing them frantically. His hands were shaking so violently that his signature was barely legible. He scratched his name across the bottom of the public retraction, the full confession to the commercial bank, and the legally binding waiver to never contact me again. He did not pause to read the fine print. He did not attempt to negotiate terms. The arrogant, demanding venture capitalist had been completely broken, reduced to a terrified, scrambling coward, desperate to delay the inevitable wrath of the federal government for even a few more hours. He finished signing the stack of papers and shoved them violently across the table toward Marcus. Richard stared down at the documents remaining in front of him. He looked older than he had ever looked before. The unearned authority he usually projected had been violently stripped away, leaving nothing but a hollow, desperate man staring at the undeniable physical proof of his own massive failures. He slowly reached out and picked up the silver pen. I watched his hand tremble as he placed the nib against the pristine white paper. He paused for a long, agonizing moment, hovering over the signature line. He was signing away his pride, his false narrative, and his final connection to the incredibly wealthy daughter he had so casually discarded. He signed his name with slow, deliberate strokes, finalizing his total and absolute surrender. Marcus efficiently gathered the signed documents, tapping the thick stack sharply against the mahogany table to align the edges. He slipped them into a secure legal folder and nodded at me, confirming that we had secured everything we needed. I stood up from my chair, buttoning my tailored suit jacket with a smooth, practiced motion. I did not offer them any parting words of wisdom or a dramatic final speech. They had taken up enough of my valuable time. I simply turned around and walked out of the conference room, leaving them sitting alone in the cold shadows to fully process the utter devastation of their ruined lives. 6 months later, the natural, inevitable consequences of their actions had entirely reshaped their reality. The highly public retraction my family was forced to sign sent massive immediate shockwaves through the city business circles and high society networks. The local media voraciously consumed the story, reporting aggressively on the full confession of the loan fraud and the exposure of the stolen estate funds. Patricia's tearful television interview became an infamous local joke, a prime example of extreme toxic manipulation. Cameron's federal trial was short and entirely brutal. Because he had signed a full confession to avoid the release of Courtney digital evidence, he had absolutely no viable legal defense. He was convicted of multiple counts of wire fraud and identity theft, and sentenced to a substantial term in a low-security federal prison. His fake venture capital firm was dissolved, and his remaining minimal assets were seized by the bank to cover a fraction of the fraudulent loan. Courtney, with her ironclad immunity agreement and top-tier legal representation, finalized a highly favorable divorce, keeping whatever personal assets she had legally protected and completely severing all ties to the disgraced family. Richard and Patricia faced their own profound specific kind of ruin. While they narrowly avoided direct federal charges for the loan fraud, their very public confession regarding the stolen estate funds resulted in massive, severe financial penalties. They were forced to completely drain their retirement accounts and aggressively liquidate their assets to cover the mounting astronomical legal fees. Blacklisted from their elite country clubs and entirely shunned by their former high society friends, they found themselves completely isolated. They were eventually forced to sell their sprawling suburban mansion at a significant loss. They moved into a cramped, noisy two-bedroom apartment in an undesirable part of the city, a jarring, profoundly miserable downgrade for a couple who had spent their entire lives obsessively projecting immense wealth. They were left with nothing but each other and the bitter, agonizing knowledge that they had actively destroyed their own golden future. The cool evening breeze swept across the expansive rooftop terrace of the Monarch, bringing with it the crisp, salty scent of the nearby ocean. It was a beautiful, clear night, and the city skyline glittered brightly in the distance. I stood near the edge of the terrace, resting my hands lightly on the polished glass railing. The restaurant below was operating at maximum capacity, humming with the sophisticated, vibrant energy of my successful hospitality group. But up here on the private reserved rooftop, the atmosphere was intimate and deeply celebratory. I turned around to look at the small group of people gathered around the luxurious fire pit. Marcus was there, laughing warmly as he recounted a particularly challenging recent legal victory. Megan, my brilliant executive assistant, was chatting animatedly with Cole, the private investigator who had proven so vital to my strategy. David, the general manager of the Monarch, was expertly pouring fresh glasses of wine for the group. They were my loyal staff, my trusted colleagues, and my fiercely supportive friends. They were the people who had stood by my side, who had believed in my vision, and who had helped me protect the empire I had built. They were my true chosen family. I lifted my crystal glass filled with the same rare $1,600 Bordeaux my family had so carelessly consumed during their pathetic ambush. But I was not drinking it to prove a point or to flaunt unearned wealth. I was drinking it because I enjoyed the taste and because I could comfortably afford to celebrate my hard-won peace. I took a slow, appreciative sip, letting the rich, complex flavor linger. I looked out over the sparkling city, completely unburdened by the heavy, toxic expectations that had defined my early life. My family had tried to crush me. They had tried to steal from me. They had tried to force me into a role of perpetual submission. But I had systematically dismantled their power, returning their vicious cruelty with calculated, unstoppable consequences. The war was permanently, decisively over. A genuine, relaxed smile spread across my face, reaching all the way to my eyes. The ultimate revenge was never just about destroying their lies or sending my brother to prison. It was about this exact beautiful moment. It was about living a magnificent, profoundly successful life, completely and utterly free of them. The hardest, yet most liberating truth I have ever had to accept is this: shared DNA is not a license for abuse, and blood does not guarantee loyalty. For decades, I believed that if I just worked harder, shrank myself a little more, or accommodated their endless demands, I would finally earn a seat at my family's table. Instead, I learned that you cannot negotiate with toxic people who view your existence purely as a transaction. If you take anything away from my journey, Let it be the absolute power of boundaries and composure. When you are faced with manipulation, gaslighting, or outright betrayal, your greatest weapon is not your anger, it is your silence, your strategy, and your success. You do not owe your abusers an explanation, and you certainly do not owe them your hard-earned peace. True power comes from documenting the truth, securing your independence, and letting their own toxic hubris be their undoing. The best revenge is not destroying them, it is building a magnificent life completely free of their shadow. Furthermore, I learned that family is not a permanent tether if it destroys your mental or financial well-being. Family is something you choose. It is the loyal friends, the supportive colleagues, and the partners who stand by you in the trenches and celebrate your victories without a trace of jealousy. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic relationship to protect your peace and build your own empire? Share your story in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit like and subscribe for more stories about setting boundaries, protecting your worth, and taking back control. Remember, if you are sitting at a table where you have to shrink to fit in, it is time to stand up and build your own.